My name is Alex. I'm 35 years old. This happened on a weekend getaway to the Oregon Dunes near Florence, when everything I knew about escape turned into my worst nightmare. It started off as a much-needed break from the daily grind. I had convinced my two closest friends, Mia, ever the adventurous spirit, and Ethan, the cautious, analytical type, to join me on a camping trip in our old RV. We even roped in Jordan, whose easy charm and knack for smooth talk usually got us out of tight spots. We rented an aging RV with a creaking engine, a faulty radio that sputtered static more often than actual conversation, and an unreliable GPS that seemed to delight in taking us off the beaten path. Our plan was simple: leave the city behind and lose ourselves in the sprawling beauty of the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. The drive itself was unsettling. The RV's engine groaned with every mile, and as we wound through deserted back roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When we finally arrived at our campsite, a remote clearing bordered by towering dunes and sparse, scraggly vegetation, the silence was almost deafening. We unloaded our gear with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Our first evening was marked by small oddities. As I was setting up the RV, I noticed a set of large, deep footprints etched into the sand around our vehicle. They were irregular, too wide and jagged to belong to any animal I could recognize. I mentioned it to Ethan, whose face immediately turned pale. "Maybe we're not alone out here," he murmured, his voice low. Mia just laughed it off, her curiosity piqued. Jordan, however, seemed unusually quiet, his eyes darting toward the darkening dunes as if they held secrets only he knew. Later that night, as the wind whipped across the sand and the RV's engine coughed to a halt with every gust, our equipment betrayed us further. The radio cut in and out, leaving only static, and my cell phone, which had been a reliable link to the world, now showed no signal at all. The isolation was complete. Before we could let the mounting unease set in, we decided to grab some dinner at a small-town diner nearby, a decision I'd soon regret. At the diner, a grizzled local in a threadbare jacket leaned over the counter and, in a hushed tone, warned us to leave before nightfall. His eyes, shadowed and haunted, spoke of horrors that he didn't dare name. We left, half mocking his words, but the warning lingered in my mind like a bad omen. The next morning, as the pale light of dawn crept over the dunes, Mia announced she was going to check out a strange glimmer she'd seen near an abandoned shack on the edge of our campsite. "I just have to see what it is," she exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. Despite Ethan's protests and my own gut feeling to keep her close, she slipped away along a narrow path, leaving only her laughter echoing briefly before silence swallowed it up. Hours passed. When Mia still hadn't returned, panic began to set in. We combed the area until the heat of midday stifled our frantic energy. Then we found it. A torn piece of her favorite scarf snagged on a rusted barbed wire fence near that abandoned shack. The sight sent a shudder through me. Mia was in trouble. Driven by fear and desperate to find her, the three of us, me, Ethan, and reluctantly Jordan, ventured deeper into the dunes. The shifting sands and eerie shadows seemed to conspire against us, and every gust of wind carried whispers that I couldn't quite decipher. That's when we stumbled upon something that chilled my blood, a hidden encampment, obscured by dunes and abandoned structures. The camp was a nightmarish tableau. Flickering bonfires illuminated crude shrines made of wood and bone, and symbols etched into weathered planks suggested dark rituals. I could see figures moving in the periphery, their silhouettes twisted and unnatural. In that horrifying moment, I realized we had unwittingly trespassed into the territory of a group known as the Dune Eaters, a cannibal cult rumored to abduct and torture unsuspecting travelers. Before we could retreat, we were ambushed. Rough hands yanked us out of the shadows as the cultists, armed with crude, jagged weapons, closed in. In the ensuing chaos, I watched in horror as Ethan was struck down by a brutal blow, his face contorted in agony. While I struggled to fend off our attackers, I caught sight of Jordan. His eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating light, and in that moment, the truth struck me like a physical blow. Jordan had been in cahoots with these savages all along. The betrayal was a knife in my back. Jordan, who had always been the glue holding our group together, stepped aside and allowed the cultists to overwhelm us. I fought with every ounce of strength, but the numbers were against us. In the melee, I lost track of Ethan and, even more horrifying, of Mia. I managed to break free and sprinted toward the only semblance of cover, the dunes themselves. My heart pounded in my ears as I dodged grasping hands and sidestepped crude traps laid in the sand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet I couldn't abandon my friends. The sight of Ethan, slumped and bloodied on the ground, drove me to make a desperate decision. I had to rescue him, even if it meant confronting the heart of this madness. I crept back toward the encampment under the cloak of darkness, my mind racing with fear and anger. The desert night was oppressive, the cool sand beneath my feet belying the inferno of terror burning inside me. I observed the cultists gathering around a makeshift altar, where Ethan was bound and barely conscious, his body battered by relentless blows. Nearby, I saw Mia's scarf, a token of her presence now stained with blood, dangling from a post, a grim reminder of what was at stake. Summoning every ounce of courage, I launched myself at the nearest attacker. The struggle was brutal and unrelenting. I grappled with a man wielding a rusted blade, and the clash of our scuffle echoed in the desolate night. My hand found a length of broken pipe, and with a cry of defiance I used it to knock the cultist off balance. In the ensuing confusion, I managed to free Ethan from his bonds. However, before we could escape, I heard a sinister laugh, a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was Jordan. His voice was low and mocking as he stepped out from the shadows. "You really thought you could outrun destiny?" he sneered. The betrayal was complete. Jordan had orchestrated our downfall, and his allegiance to the cult was as clear as the blood on my hands. Before I could react further, cultists surged upon us. In the ensuing scuffle, Jordan was seized by his former comrades, a twisted form of retribution for his betrayal, and dragged away into the darkness. I watched, helpless, as they disappeared into the dunes, leaving behind a silence that screamed of unfinished business. Ethan, bloodied and barely conscious, managed to whisper, "Mia," before slipping into unconsciousness. I knew then that Mia's fate was intertwined with this horror. She had been taken, just like Ethan had been nearly lost. The loss was unbearable. I clutched her scarf, its fabric a cruel reminder of her vibrant spirit now silenced. With no time to mourn, I had to make a choice. Either confront the monstrous cult leader head-on or retreat and seek help, but there was no help to be had in these isolated sands. The local authorities had already dismissed the diner warning as drunken ramblings, and my phone remained dead, a lifeline severed by the oppressive isolation. I chose to press forward, fueled by a mixture of grief, guilt, and the need to put an end to the nightmare. I navigated the labyrinth of dunes and makeshift shrines until I reached a central clearing where the cult leader presided over a final, ghastly ritual. His presence was commanding. A gaunt, feral man with wild eyes and a ritual knife stained with ancient, unholy blood. He chanted in a guttural tongue that reverberated through the night air, his voice rising above the whispers of the dunes. I burst into the clearing, weapon in hand, and chaos erupted. The cultists, caught off guard, momentarily faltered. I charged at the leader, our eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The knife clashed against my makeshift weapon, and every blow was a desperate plea for justice. For Mia, for Ethan, for every lost soul claimed by these savages. The struggle was violent and raw. I felt the sting of metal against flesh, and in a moment of brutal clarity, I landed a decisive blow that sent the cult leader staggering back. His eyes, wide with shock, met mine before he collapsed, his dark power extinguished. But even as I stood victorious in that clearing, the cost was etched into every line of my face. In the aftermath of the assault, the silence of the dunes returned, a silence that was as oppressive as it was final. I dragged Ethan away from the clearing, his fate uncertain, and fled into the night with nothing but the echo of my own heartbeat and the haunting promise that this nightmare was far from over. I never learned the full extent of Jordan's treachery, nor did I ever find out what truly happened to Mia. All I had were fragmented memories, a torn scarf, the taste of betrayal, and the overwhelming sense that evil had seeped into every grain of sand in that forsaken place. Now, as I write these words from the safety of a small roadside motel far from the dunes, I know that nothing will ever be the same. The desert holds secrets that defy explanation, and the echoes of that night still whisper to me in the silence of every dark, lonely hour. I am haunted by the faces of those I lost, and tormented by the betrayal that nearly cost us our lives. And though I have escaped physically, the nightmare clings to my soul, a constant reminder that sometimes, in the isolation of our own making, evil finds a way to claim us all. My name is Liam. I'm 40 years old. This happened in the deep, shadowy expanse of Tillamuk State Forest, Oregon, a place where the towering pines and thick fog whispered secrets of old tragedies and unatoned sins. I set out in my aging RV, hoping that solitude would wash away the stains of a past accident I could never forget. I was burdened with guilt that clung to me like a second skin, and I believed that the isolation of the forest might offer me the redemption I so desperately sought. The RV had seen better days. Its engine groaned with every mile, and its radio crackled with intermittent bursts of static. I knew the equipment was temperamental, but I welcomed the challenge, anything to keep the world at bay. After a long drive along winding back roads and through thick, misty landscapes, I finally found a secluded site deep within the forest. The clearing was surrounded by ancient pines, whose gnarled branches reached out like skeletal hands. For the first few hours, the silence was almost comforting. I set up camp, parked the RV, and tried to settle my thoughts. Yet, that night, nature had other plans. A sudden violent storm rolled in without warning. Rain battered the RV, and the wind howled through the trees, turning the forest into a cacophony of sound and fury. Amid the tumult, the RV's engine sputtered and finally died, leaving me stranded and cut off from any connection to the outside world. I fumbled with the ignition, but nothing worked. The isolation deepened with each passing minute as I listened to the relentless drumming of rain and the eerie rustle of leaves. Then, in the midst of the storm's clamor, I heard it. A mournful, unearthly wail that seemed to rise from the very depths of the forest. The sound was at once haunting and accusatory, carrying a weight of sorrow that chilled me to the bone. I couldn't tell if it was the wind playing tricks on my ears or something far more sinister. Shivering, I forced myself to step outside and peer into the darkness, but the storm obscured everything. In the weak light of my dying RV lamp, I noticed strange carvings on the trunk of a nearby tree. The symbols were cryptic and jagged, as if scrawled in a fit of despair, and they whispered of punishment and redemption. The next morning, after a night filled with restless, fevered dreams, I attempted to repair the RV. My efforts were futile. The engine remained stubbornly silent. I decided to seek help and perhaps an explanation for the bizarre events. Venturing out on foot, I encountered Sam, a grizzled park ranger with deep-set eyes that had seen more than he cared to share. In a low, gravelly voice, he warned me about the forest's dark legend, the Banshee. According to him, the Banshee was a spirit doomed to wander these woods, her soul forever tethered to the tragedies and unatoned sins of those who had hurt or lost someone. He told me that her wail was an omen, a cry of anguish that foretold misfortune. His words, laced with sorrow, only deepened my unease. As the days wore on, the Banshee's cry returned, growing more persistent and insistent. At first, I dismissed it as the natural cry of a forlorn wind, but as the sound became more distinct, a lament that felt like a plea, I could no longer ignore it. In the peripheral edges of my vision, I began to catch fleeting glimpses of a spectral figure. In the hazy distance between the trees, I saw her, a woman in tattered ethereal garments, her face obscured by a veil of mist, her eyes filled with an unbearable sorrow that mirrored the guilt I carried within. My nights became tormented by the Banshee's wails and memories of the accident that haunted me, a car crash that had taken a life I could never bring back. The sound seeped into my dreams, transforming them into endless corridors of regret and mourning. I began to question whether the Banshee was a true supernatural force or merely a manifestation of my own tormented psyche. Desperate for answers, I started exploring the forest. I followed a series of cryptic signs, the markings on trees, faded photographs abandoned by previous campers, and scattered relics that seemed to echo a lost past. On one such excursion, I encountered Ivy, a mysterious hermit who lived on the outskirts of the forest. With eyes that hinted at both wisdom and sorrow, she told me that the Banshee was more than just a ghost. She was the embodiment of unresolved guilt and unacknowledged pain. Ivy explained that many who had come to the forest seeking solace had been visited by the Banshee, only to be forced to confront the darkness they carried within. I took her words to heart, and as I delved deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that every step I took was guided by a force both malevolent and compassionate. The forest, with its oppressive fog and twisting trails, became a labyrinth of my own inner torment. The weather turned increasingly violent. Driving rain, dense fog, and bone-chilling winds trapped me in a cycle of despair and isolation. Each mechanical failure of the RV was a reminder that I was entirely on my own, cut off from the modern world and its conveniences. Then came the night that shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy. I was sitting in the dim light of my RV, attempting to journal my thoughts in the flickering glow of a dying battery, when the Banshee's cry erupted with a ferocity I had never experienced before. The sound was closer now, as if she were circling the RV, mourning my every misstep. It was a heart-wrenching blend of grief and anger, a dirge that echoed through the pines and rattled the very air around me. In a state of panic, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the storm, determined to find the source of the sound. The rain drenched me instantly, and the cold seeped into my bones as I followed the mournful wail. I could see the spectral figure more clearly now. She hovered near an ancient clearing, her form illuminated by the intermittent flashes of lightning. As I drew nearer, her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I felt as if every regret, every sorrow, was laid bare before her. The banshee's gaze was filled with such profound sorrow that I couldn't help but weep, recognizing the pain that had defined my own existence. I fell to my knees in the mud, my voice hoarse as I pleaded for forgiveness, not only from the spirit before me, but from the memory of the life I had destroyed. The banshee's wail softened into something akin to a sigh, and for a brief moment the oppressive weight of guilt lifted. But then the storm surged again, and with it came a violent gust that tore through the clearing. In the chaos, the banshee's form began to dissipate, swallowed by the swirling mists as though she were retreating back into the depths of the forest. I returned to my RV, feeling both a sense of catharsis and an unbearable loss. The banshee had confronted me with the truth of my past, forcing me to face the mistakes I had long tried to bury. Yet, even as the storm subsided and a fragile dawn broke through the fog, the banshee's distant cry still echoed in the back of my mind, a reminder that forgiveness was not a destination, but a continuous, arduous journey. In the following days, I attempted to repair the RV with little success. The engine remained silent, a constant metaphor for my own inability to escape the past. I continued my solitary wanderings through the forest, each step laden with the weight of memory and the soft, persistent echoes of the banshee's lament. I began to document my experiences, writing down every detail in the hope that by acknowledging my guilt, I might find a path to redemption. The forest, in its infinite capacity for both beauty and terror, had become my confessor. Each carved symbol on a tree, every forlorn relic discovered along a forgotten trail, and even the relentless drumming of the rain against the RV's metal exterior, all of it seemed to whisper that healing would only come when I finally embraced the pain I had tried so hard to deny. One crisp morning, as the mist slowly receded and the forest revealed its subdued, melancholic beauty, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The banshee's wail, once a harbinger of doom, had softened into a distant echo, an ever-present reminder of the need to forgive and to let go. I wasn't entirely free of guilt, nor did I expect to be, but I had begun the long, arduous process of confronting my inner demons. Eventually, with no hope of reviving the old RV, I made the decision to leave the forest. As I loaded my few belongings into a battered truck I managed to rent in a nearby town, I paused for a moment at the edge of the woods. The forest, with all its haunting beauty and sorrow, had shown me that redemption was not found in isolation, but in the acknowledgement of one's own mistakes. I took a deep breath, listening to the soft, almost imperceptible cry of the banshee in the distance, a sound that no longer filled me with dread, but with a bittersweet hope that even the deepest wounds could one day begin to heal. Now, as I drive away from Tillamuk State Forest, the banshee's lament still lingers in my memories, a spectral reminder of the night I faced my past head-on. I carry with me the knowledge that some ghosts, whether of our own making or of the world beyond, never fully disappear. But I also know that by confronting them, we may finally learn to forgive ourselves, even if the journey is shrouded in endless twilight. My name is Elena. I'm 32 years old. This happened in the heart of the Willamet National Forest, Oregon, a place where rain-soaked pines and winding trails hide secrets older than time. I had just left behind a string of personal and professional failures, a painful breakup, and a career in ruins, and I believed that a solitary RV camping trip might help me reclaim some semblance of control over my life. Instead, I found that the road to renewal is paved with shadows from a past I never knew I shared. My RV was a relic of better days, its once bright paint now chipped and faded, its engine a constant weary groan. I had chosen it precisely because its imperfections felt like a mirror to my own battered spirit. The moment I set off, I noticed oddities that made me question if it was just my imagination or something far more sinister. In the back of the RV, every mirror and window seemed to distort my reflection ever so slightly. A lagging, twisted echo that moved with an unsettling delay. The lights flickered sporadically, and the radio, more often than not, was filled with static that occasionally morphed into guttural whispers I couldn't quite decipher. Setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, I initially felt a fragile peace. The damp earth, the smell of rain on leaves, and the hush of the forest promised solitude and, perhaps, healing. Yet, as dusk fell, I began to notice something else. In every reflective surface, be it a car window or a tarnished piece of metal, I saw a shadow that wasn't mine. A figure, moving just a few steps behind me, mimicked my every action with an eerie delay. I tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, perhaps a misperception born of exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that something was very wrong. That unease grew when, rummaging through the glove compartment for a map, I discovered a folded, yellowed note tucked away in a forgotten corner. It read simply, "Beware the mirror." My pulse quickened as I stared at the hastily scrawled letters. Who had left this? And what did it mean? The note was a cryptic warning, a harbinger of the dark legacy I was about to uncover. A few days later, with my mind still whirling from the initial strangeness, I decided to visit a remote gas station a short drive away. I needed fuel, both for my RV and for my resolve to understand what was happening. The attendant there was a taciturn man named Rick, his weathered face and cautious eyes speaking of more than a few secrets. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, he told me in a low, gravelly tone about the cursed reputation of this part of the forest. He mentioned an old legend, a man, long ago, who made a pact with the devil in these very woods. His bargain had cast a long, dark shadow, a legacy that some said had seeped into the very soil and, through twisted fate, into the bloodlines of the locals. I felt a chill as Rick's words resonated with something buried deep within me. A vague, unsettling familiarity I couldn't yet place. Once back in my RV, I combed through the local archives and old newspaper clippings I had found stashed in a small-town library. The faded articles spoke of bizarre disappearances, inexplicable occurrences, and supernatural encounters tied to the cursed legacy of the area. As I pieced together the fragments of history, I began to sense that my own family might be entwined in this dark tapestry. Memories of awkward family gatherings and hushed conversations now took on a sinister hue, hinting at secrets I had never been told. The supernatural events escalated rapidly over the following days. Each morning, as I sipped stale coffee in the dim light of my RV, I found that the reflections had grown more disturbing. Not only did they show my image, but in the periphery of each mirror, a sinister doppelganger with a malevolent grin began to appear. It was as if an evil twin, spawned from a cursed lineage, was determined to manifest itself in every reflective surface. Electrical malfunctions worsened. The lights flickered in a chaotic rhythm, and the radio would occasionally burst into low, desperate whispers that made my skin crawl. At night, I was tormented by flashbacks. Vague, unsettling memories of family secrets and gatherings that I had long suppressed. The whispers, the flickers, and the ever-growing presence of that warped reflection eroded my grip on reality. One particularly bitter night, with a storm raging outside and my RV isolated from any sign of modern connectivity, I was jolted awake by a sudden icy chill. I stepped outside to find the temperature plummeting, my breath forming mist in the air. And there, just beyond the thin glass of my window, stood the figure. no longer confined to reflections, the doppelganger had materialized outside the RV. Its eyes glowed with an unyielding malice, and its form was disturbingly similar to mine, a perverse, twisted mirror image that moved with an unsettling deliberateness. The oppressive presence filled the air with a sense of impending doom, and I felt an instinctual urge to flee, though I was rooted to the spot by terror and a grim fascination. It wasn't long before the full horror of the situation became undeniable. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, I found myself returning to the RV's interior one fateful evening. There, in a large cracked mirror that hung on the wall, a relic from the RV's early days, the doppelganger fully materialized within the reflective surface. Its eyes met mine with an almost sentient cruelty, as if challenging me to confront the dark truths it embodied. In that moment, a surge of fragmented memories rushed through me. I recalled hushed family conversations, cryptic warnings passed down through generations, and an underlying sense of foreboding that had always lurked in the background of my childhood. The truth hit me like a cold wave. My family's history was not as ordinary as I had believed. A distant ancestor had struck a diabolical bargain, a pact with the devil that had cursed our bloodline. And now that cursed legacy had manifested in the form of this malevolent doppelganger, a living embodiment of our inherited darkness. Confronted with this horrifying revelation, I was forced to choose between succumbing to the darkness that had defined my lineage or fighting to break the cycle of evil. Desperation drove me to scour the old archives and records once more, searching for any mention of a ritual that could sever this unholy bond. I discovered a faded account of an ancient rite, a dangerous and painstaking ritual designed to sever the cursed connection that bound our family to that infernal pact. With trembling hands and a heart full of fear and resolve, I decided to attempt it, knowing that the alternative was a fate worse than death, eternal subjugation to a malevolent force that mirrored every dark aspect of my soul. I gathered the necessary items: a rusted, old ceremonial dagger, a handful of salt, a tattered piece of parchment inscribed with cryptic symbols, and a vial of water from a nearby stream believed to be blessed by a long-forgotten saint. As the storm raged outside, I prepared the ritual in the cramped confines of my RV, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the aging vehicle seemed to echo with the voices of those who had come before me. With the ritual laid out before me, I faced the large, cracked mirror once more. The doppelganger was there, its form coalescing in the reflection with a twisted sneer, as if mocking my futile attempt at redemption. I began to recite the incantation I had painstakingly memorized, my voice shaking but determined. The room grew colder, and the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. In a violent burst of supernatural energy, the doppelganger lashed out, its presence overwhelming the space with a force that shattered the silence and sent shards of glass cascading across the floor. The struggle was fierce and surreal. I fought not only against the spectral entity but against the dark legacy it represented, a torrent of inherited guilt and malevolence that threatened to swallow me whole. The mirror vibrated violently, and for a moment I felt as if my very soul was being torn asunder by the relentless assault of supernatural fury. The dagger slipped from my grasp as I staggered back, the echoes of my incantation mingling with the thunder outside. In that fevered moment, everything hung in the balance. The mirror, now cracked and splintered, seemed to hold the collective agony of generations. The doppelganger's voice, a distorted echo of my own, whispered taunts and accusations, dredging up memories of failures and sins I had long tried to forget. I pressed on, summoning every ounce of willpower to complete the ritual, to sever the cursed connection once and for all. My voice grew steadier as I reached the final lines of the incantation, the words resonating with a power that defied the chaos around me. When the last syllable left my lips, there was a moment of deafening silence. The oppressive force seemed to pause, as if the universe itself held its breath. Slowly, the mirror's surface began to still, the malevolent image of the doppelganger wavering uncertainly. Then, with a final, shuddering convulsion, the shattered fragments of the mirror fell silent, their whispers fading into the darkness of the RV. I collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, my heart pounding as I struggled to catch my breath. The ritual was complete, or so it seemed. In that fragile silence, I could no longer tell if I had broken the cursed cycle or merely postponed the inevitable. I was left with a deep, unshakable scar, a reminder that some shadows, no matter how thoroughly banished, never fully disappear. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of a makeshift dawn, far from the oppressive forests of Willamet, yet still haunted by echoes of that night, I cannot say with certainty whether I am truly free. The mirror's remnants, long shattered and strewn about the RV, still seem to whisper in the quiet moments of the day, as if reminding me that the legacy of darkness may linger in the corners of one's soul. I have learned that redemption, if it is ever to be found, comes at a terrible cost. I am scarred both physically and spiritually, and while I have fought to break the cycle of evil, I know that the battle may never truly be over. I drive away now with a heavy heart and a cautious hope that the shattered reflections of the past will not one day coalesce into a whole again. Every reflective surface, every glint of light in a window, carries with it the faint, unsettling memory of a time when my own reflection almost became my undoing. And though I have taken a step toward reclaiming my life, I remain ever vigilant. Because sometimes, in the silence of the night, even the smallest whisper of a mirror can summon the darkest parts of our heritage back into view. My name is Alice Moreno. I am 34 years old. This happened in the heart of the Willamet National Forest, a place renowned for its towering pines, whispering winds, and a legacy of dark legends I never truly believed until that fateful RV trip. I had planned the expedition with two companions, Brandon Hayes, a man whose cautious, almost clinical demeanor always made me feel safe, even when he urged retreat at every suspicious sign, and Connor Reed, whose unbridled curiosity and thrill-seeking nature injected energy into our journey. We set off in a beat-up RV, determined to capture the untouched beauty of Oregon's wilderness on film, and to document our adventure through personal vlogs. The destination was a secluded clearing near an area steeped in local folklore, rumored to be cursed by forces older than time itself. Our journey began on a crisp autumn morning. The roads were slick with early dew, and the forest's edge welcomed us with an eerie stillness. As we drove deeper into the wilderness, small glitches began to surface. The RV's engine started misfiring unexpectedly, and the radio, usually a comforting companion, filled with static and odd, disembodied voices. I chalked it up to the remote location and the unpredictable nature of our old vehicle, but a nagging sense of foreboding lingered. That evening, as we set up camp near a cluster of ancient pines, I noticed something unsettling. Carved into the bark of a particularly gnarled tree were strange symbols, twisted versions of Native American motifs distorted into something sinister. I ran my fingers over the carvings, my heart pounding as I imagined what hands might have etched them there. Nearby, birds circled our RV, and the distant barking of dogs from local homesteads added to the disquiet. Brandon's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of here now." But Connor, ever the adventurer, scoffed at the idea. "It's just a bit of local lore," he insisted, already pulling out his camera to record the eerie artistry. His defiance, though thrilling to some extent, only deepened my anxiety. I tried to mediate, pleading for caution, but even as I did, a palpable tension grew among us. That night, as dusk melted into darkness, I sat awake in the RV, listening to the forest's dissonant symphony. The wind's soft moan was punctuated by distant rustles and the faint sound of footsteps. It wasn't long before I caught sight of a shadow among the trees, a figure barely distinguishable, with eyes that glinted unnaturally in the dim light. I told myself it was merely a trick of the light, but a cold shiver traveled down my spine. The following day we ventured deeper into the forest, drawn by a strange compulsion to explore the area marked by those foreboding symbols. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us, as if it were a living, breathing entity with secrets to guard. At one point, while examining a particularly elaborate carving on a massive oak, Connor suddenly excused himself. He said he needed to capture a better angle of the carving, and with a charismatic smile he promised to be right back. I should have insisted he stay with us, but his enthusiasm was infectious, and I trusted his judgment, until his absence became a sinister void. Hours passed, and as twilight bled into night, panic gripped me. I turned to Brandon, only to find his expression unreadable, his eyes betraying something dark. He offered vague reassurances, but his tone was strained. It wasn't long before the truth revealed itself in the most harrowing way imaginable. While combing through a dense thicket, searching for any sign of Connor, I heard agonized cries echoing through the trees. Following the sounds, I discovered a clearing where the air was thick with malevolence. There, in the center, lay Connor, if I could call him that anymore. His body was contorted, marked by deep, ritualistic symbols scorched into his skin. His eyes, once filled with life, now reflected a maddened emptiness, as if something unspeakable had taken root within him. My heart pounded in disbelief as I knelt beside him, tears streaming down my face. In that agonizing moment, I realized we were dealing with more than just natural dangers. The local legends we had dismissed as mere folklore were coming terrifyingly to life. The creature responsible, which the locals had whispered about in hushed tones, was none other than the skinwalker, a shape-shifting force that mimics familiar faces, using our own memories against us to lure us into isolation and terror. I scrambled to my feet, desperate for answers, when Brandon's confession shattered what little trust remained between us. In a trembling voice, he admitted that he had been in covert contact with a local faction, a cult rumored to worship the skinwalker as a dark deity. He had known about the legends all along, and driven by his own hidden agenda, he had allowed us to venture into the heart of this cursed land. His betrayal was a knife to the heart. "I thought I could control it," he whispered, eyes glistening with regret and something darker, but I underestimated what it was capable of. Before I could react, the forest erupted into chaos. Figures emerged from the gloom, members of the cult, their faces twisted in fanatic devotion. They surrounded us, their voices rising in a maddening chant that seemed to merge with the rustling leaves. In the ensuing mayhem, the skinwalker made its presence known in full. Its form shifted constantly, a grotesque amalgamation of faces and limbs, sometimes resembling the missing local hiker we'd seen earlier, other times a monstrous distortion of human features. The creature's malevolent laughter echoed around us as it advanced, and I realized with horror that its influence was seeping into every shadow of the forest. Brandon, caught between his loyalties and the overwhelming force of his secret pact, hesitated when I called for help. His indecision allowed the cult members to close in, and soon the confrontation escalated into brutal violence. I fought desperately, wielding an old metal pipe I found in the RV as my only weapon. The chaos was indescribable. A blur of screams, the sickening sound of bones breaking, and the acrid stench of burning leaves mingling with something far fouler. In the melee, I lost sight of Brandon, and all my focus went to rescuing Connor. I fought through the thicket of cultists and the swirling horror of the skinwalker's shape-shifting form. Every step felt like a descent into madness. I managed to pull Connor from the clutches of one of the cultists, his body trembling, his eyes half closed in a state that bordered on possession. His voice was low and distorted, as if speaking through a veil of agony. "Alice, help me," it pleaded in broken whispers. My mind reeled with the realization that I had to make a choice between risking everything to save Connor from a fate that might render him irreversibly lost to the darkness, or fleeing this cursed forest to preserve my own sanity and life. The forest around me seemed to pulse with the dark energy of the skinwalker, every creak and rustle a reminder of the unseen horror stalking us. I decided to fight. Clutching my makeshift weapon and bolstered by a desperate surge of determination, I gathered every ounce of strength to launch a counterattack. I lunged back into the fray, taking down any cult member who came too close, my mind a chaotic mix of grief, rage, and survival instinct. The skinwalker, relentless and cunning, circled above like a predator, its form twisting and contorting with every passing moment. In the midst of the struggle, I caught a glimpse of Brandon. His eyes, now vacant and haunted by regret, met mine. There was no longer the man I had once trusted, only a shell corrupted by dark ambition and the insidious influence of the cult. In that brief, heart-wrenching moment, betrayal crystallized into a tangible force, as I realized that the man who had once promised to protect us had become an adversary in his own right. The battle raged on, a desperate melee under the shroud of a moonless night. Every blow I struck felt heavy with the weight of loss and the desperate hope of redemption. In the final, chaotic moments, the skinwalker's form reached out with tendrils of shadow, attempting to drag me into the abyss. My body screamed in protest as I fought against its pull, every muscle straining in the effort to remain free. By some miracle, or perhaps by the sheer force of will, I managed to break free and drive the creature back with one last, furious swing of my pipe. The skinwalker let out a bone-chilling shriek, its form dissipating into the darkness as the cult members, now leaderless and disoriented, fled into the forest. In the eerie silence that followed, I cradled a trembling Connor in my arms, his tortured gaze meeting mine. He was alive, but forever changed. A broken shell haunted by the torment of his ordeal. In the aftermath, as dawn broke and the first rays of light pierced the canopy, I made the painful decision to leave the forest behind. I helped Connor into the RV, his body weak and his spirit shattered. Brandon was nowhere to be found. His betrayal complete, he had vanished into the labyrinth of the forest, leaving behind only the bitter taste of treachery. The drive back to civilization was a blur of haunted memories and unspoken sorrow. Every mile I traveled felt like a penance for the trust I had once placed in others, and for the innocence that had been so brutally stripped away in the darkness of Willamet National Forest. Even now, as I write these words in the sterile safety of my small apartment, I can still hear the whispers of the wind, the faint echo of a mad chant, and the haunting laughter of the skinwalker. A reminder that some evils never truly die. I learned that night that survival in the wilderness isn't just about braving the elements or outsmarting a wild animal. It's about confronting the darkness within and around us, and understanding that sometimes the most dangerous creatures are not those that lurk in the shadows, but the ones we allow into our hearts. My journey through the cursed forest left scars that will never fully heal. A constant reminder that trust is fragile, and that even in our darkest moments the line between human frailty and supernatural horror can blur into a nightmare from which there is no easy escape. As I continue to piece together my shattered memories, I know one thing for certain. The Willamet National Forest, with its ancient pines and hidden malevolence, remains a place where the past and present collide in a deadly dance, a dance that I was all too eager to join, until betrayal and terror forced me to run from the darkness I once sought to understand. My name is Ethan Blackwood. I'm 42. This happened one bleak November as I left behind a past filled with unspeakable guilt and regret to drive my aging RV through the winding, mist-shrouded roads of the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. I had spent years trying to outrun my memories, a former detective haunted by cases that never saw justice and personal failures that clawed at my soul. With every mile I put between myself and that painful history, I hoped I might find a measure of redemption, or at least a chance to live with my mistakes a little less painfully. The journey began on a cold morning, the sky a heavy slate of clouds that promised rain. My RV, a battered relic that had carried me through countless trips, groaned and shuddered as I navigated its worn-out engine along the slick, winding roads. I'd always relied on its steady hum as a kind of lullaby to distract me from the relentless memories of what I'd failed to save. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, and the radio, once a reliable companion on these lonely stretches, spat out bursts of static that seemed to carry disjointed voices. Sometimes, when the static subsided just enough, I thought I heard snippets of words that sounded uncomfortably like my own inner criticisms. You can't hide. It all comes back. You're to blame. I dismissed it as a malfunction of old technology, but the unease it stirred in me was hard to ignore. I pulled over at a small rest area, set into the rugged landscape, its concrete benches and empty vending machine a silent testament to decades of neglect. As I sat on a frayed blanket beside the RV, the wind howled through the pines, and the low murmur of the river in the distance mingled with the persistent hum of static from the radio. I tried to focus on the natural beauty around me, the way the fading light turned the water to liquid silver, the rugged cliffs standing like ancient sentinels, but my thoughts were heavy with regret. It wasn't long before I noticed that some of my personal items, things I was certain I had neatly stored away, were now inexplicably out of place. A battered notebook, a watch that had stopped ticking years ago, and even a set of keys I didn't remember misplacing were scattered on the floor of the RV. It was as if someone, or something, had been rummaging through my life while I slept. That night, as darkness fell over the gorge, I couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat in the dim interior of my RV, listening to the eerie symphony of creaks and rattles that accompanied every gust of wind. The radio's static had morphed into a disjointed whisper, and at times it almost sounded like an accusatory voice. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, fueled by isolation and regret, but the sensation of being watched was too palpable. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that I first saw him, the ghost. I was jolted awake by a sudden chill that seemed to seep through the walls of the RV. Blinking in the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing just beyond the weak circle of light from a small lamp. There he was, A young man, his face contorted with sorrow and anger, his eyes deep pools of haunting regret. For a moment I couldn't move, frozen by a mixture of fear and recognition, as if he were a mirror reflecting the guilt I'd long tried to ignore. The figure vanished as abruptly as he had appeared, leaving behind only a lingering sense of accusation. The following morning, still trembling from the encounter, I decided to press on, hoping that the early disturbances were just the product of an overactive imagination. I resumed my journey along the twisting road, my thoughts a jumble of half-remembered cases and the ghost's unyielding stare. In a brief stop at a dilapidated fuel station, I met a grizzled old truck driver who, over a cup of bitter coffee, offered me a warning. "These roads," he said in a gravelly voice, "have a way of dredging up the past. Don't be surprised if you see more than just your reflection in the headlights." I nodded politely, though his words resonated more deeply than I cared to admit. As the days wore on, the disturbances in my RV grew more persistent. The radio continued to transmit strange messages, sometimes in clear, accusatory tones that matched the whispers I'd heard during the night. At times, objects would shift positions on their own. A mug moved from its usual perch, a map unfurled to reveal routes I hadn't planned to explore. It was as if my RV itself were haunted by memories and regrets that I had tried so desperately to lock away. Every unexpected creak, every unexplained flicker of the dashboard lights seemed to push me closer to the edge of my long-held composure. One particularly stormy night, as rain lashed against the metal exterior of the RV and the wind howled like the voices of the lost, I resolved to investigate an abandoned rest stop I had spotted earlier on the road. It was a lonely, forgotten structure, half swallowed by the encroaching forest, its faded sign barely legible in the downpour. I felt inexplicably drawn to it, as if it held the answers to the questions that had tormented me for so long. With little more than a flashlight in my determination to confront whatever lay in wait, I stepped out of the RV and made my way toward the structure. The building was a relic of a bygone era, its walls stained with time and neglect, its windows dark and lifeless. As I pushed open the creaking door, a wave of cold, musty air greeted me, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and decaying paper. Inside, the space was cavernous and desolate, the only light coming from the narrow beam of my flashlight. I wandered slowly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, until I reached a wide, open room where the air seemed to pulse with a strange, mournful energy. It was there, in that forsaken place, that the ghost reappeared. At first, he was nothing more than a flicker at the edge of my vision, a shape that moved with an almost imperceptible grace. But as I stood frozen, his form grew more distinct. He was young, his features sharply defined even in the dim light, and his eyes, those eyes, were filled with an intense sorrow and unrelenting fury. I felt as though he were judging me, his silent gaze a mirror to the guilt that I had carried all these years. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. The silence was broken only by the distant rumble of the storm and the pounding of my heart. Then, as if compelled by an invisible force, memories began to assault me. I saw flashes of my past, cases left unsolved, moments of negligence, the faces of victims whose voices I had failed to hear. The ghost's presence became a torrent of images and emotions, overwhelming me with the weight of my own regrets. I could feel the sting of every mistake, the suffocating burden of guilt that had haunted me in quiet moments and now threatened to consume me entirely. Unable to contain the surge of emotion any longer, I staggered backward, my voice barely a whisper as I confessed, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The words, raw and desperate, echoed through the empty room, mingling with the ghost's silent accusation. I expected an outburst, a violent retribution for my sins, but instead, something unexpected happened. The intensity in the ghost's eyes wavered, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the furious glare was replaced by something akin to sorrow. It was as if my admission had unlocked a door to understanding, to a painful but necessary reconciliation with my past. The building trembled as if in response to my confession. Dust fell from the cracked ceiling, and the cold that had gripped me began to recede, replaced by a fragile warmth. I stood there, drenched in the aftermath of my outburst, uncertain of what had transpired. Had the ghost truly softened, or was it merely another illusion, another torment conjured by my guilty conscience? I slowly retreated from the abandoned rest stop, my mind reeling from the confrontation. The storm had begun to abate as I made my way back to the RV, every step feeling both heavy and hopeful. When I reached the vehicle, I discovered that the bizarre disturbances had ceased. The radio, which had once been a relentless source of cryptic messages, now lay silent, its static replaced by a calm, steady hum. The personal items that had been inexplicably moved were back in their rightful places, as if the chaos of the past few days had been swept away by the storm. Sitting alone in the dim light of the RV, I allowed myself to reflect on the events of the night. I knew that I could never erase the mistakes of my past, nor could I undo the harm that had been done. But perhaps, in facing the spectral embodiment of my guilt, I had taken the first tentative steps toward healing. The ghost, that anguished figure who had mirrored my own inner torment, had seemed to recede as I embraced my failures and acknowledged the pain I had long denied. It was a small victory, a moment of catharsis in a life otherwise defined by regret. In the days that followed, as I continued my solitary journey along the Columbia River Gorge, the oppressive sense of isolation gradually gave way to a tentative peace. The roads, once shrouded in an almost tangible darkness, began to open up before me, bathed in the soft light of late autumn afternoons. I found myself paying closer attention to the beauty of the landscape, the way the rugged cliffs and winding rivers spoke of endurance and transformation. Each mile was a step away from the ghosts of my past, and every quiet moment in the RV became an opportunity to rebuild the shattered pieces of my soul. I never did see the spectral figure again, at least not in the vivid accusatory form that had once haunted that abandoned rest stop. Yet there were moments when the wind whispered through the trees or the radio emitted a brief, unintentional murmur, when I would catch a fleeting glimpse of something that reminded me of his presence. In those moments, I no longer felt the crushing weight of guilt, but a solemn reminder of the necessity of facing one's inner demons. I had learned that some ghosts were not external forces to be feared, but manifestations of the pain we carry inside. A pain that, when confronted, could eventually lead to understanding and forgiveness. Every night as I parked my RV in a new, often desolate spot along the gorge, I would sit by the window and watch the interplay of light and shadow, listening to the soft hum of the engine and the distant murmur of the river. In those quiet hours, I began to see my journey not just as an escape, but as a path toward reconciliation with my past. I recorded my thoughts in a battered journal, writing down every small detail, every flash of insight that came to me in the solitude of the road. Over time, those entries became less about regret and more about the slow, painful process of accepting my imperfections. I recall one particularly clear night when the stars were out in full force, their light piercing the darkness like tiny beacons of hope. I sat outside the RV on a cold, dew-laden morning and thought about the ghost. A young man who had, in his own tragic way, represented all the pain I had tried to escape. I whispered a silent prayer, not for forgiveness from others, but for forgiveness of myself. It was then I realized that while the past might always be a part of who I am, it did not have to define my future. As the weeks turned into months, I found that the road continued to offer me lessons in resilience and transformation. The gorge, with its rugged beauty and hidden histories, became both a refuge and a mirror reflecting the strength I had long forgotten. My RV, once a symbol of isolation and mechanical failure, now served as my mobile sanctuary, a place where I could confront my memories in solitude and, in doing so, gradually learn to live with them. Even now, as I write these words in the quiet of a chilly evening, I feel a sense of cautious optimism. The ghosts of my past may still linger in the corners of my mind, but they no longer wield the same power over me. I have come to understand that redemption is not a single, miraculous moment, but a continuous journey, a series of small, deliberate steps taken each day, even on roads lined with shadow and sorrow. The Columbia River Gorge remains a constant companion on my journey, a living tapestry of nature's grandeur and the quiet resilience of those who traverse its ancient paths. Every time I drive along its winding roads, I am reminded of the night when I finally faced the specter of my guilt and found, in that painful confrontation, the seeds of a new beginning. And though the road ahead may still be treacherous and uncertain, I now travel it with the conviction that the most daunting obstacles are often the ones within ourselves. My journey is far from over. I continue to drive, to search for moments of clarity amid the chaos, and to document the lessons learned along the way. The ghost may have faded into memory, but his silent message remains with me, a reminder that facing the darkness is the only way to reclaim the light. Each day, as I navigate the misty, unpredictable roads of the gorge, I carry that message close to my heart. I know that while I may never fully escape the burden of my past, I can choose to forge ahead, step by painful step, toward a future defined not by regret, but by the courage to embrace the unknown. And so, as the twilight deepens and the last traces of daylight fade into the inky canvas of night, I sit by the window of my RV and watch the shadows dance. I reflect on all I have endured: the malfunctioning radio, the eerie movements of objects, the ghostly confrontation at an abandoned rest stop, and the cathartic admission of my guilt. Each of these experiences, terrifying as they were, has brought me closer to understanding that redemption lies in the acceptance of our imperfections. I have learned that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the demons within, no matter how painful or frightening that process may be. My name is Ethan Blackwood, and though my past remains a part of me, I have finally taken the first steps toward letting it go. As I continue on this long, uncertain road, I do so with the knowledge that every mile, every moment of quiet introspection, is a part of the journey to reclaiming my life. The road to reckoning is endless, but now, for the first time in years, I am ready to face it head-on. My name is Ethan Blackwood. I'm 42. This happened one cold, bitter November, as I left behind a life weighed down by guilt and regret to traverse the rugged, winding roads of the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. Once a dedicated detective, I now carried the burden of unsolved cases and personal failures like scars etched deep into my soul. I loaded up my aging RV, a clunky, creaking machine that had seen better days, and set off with the hope that the endless road might somehow lead me to redemption, or at least a temporary escape from my haunted past. The gorge unfolded before me in a tapestry of dramatic cliffs, swirling mists, and tumultuous river rapids. The beauty was undeniable, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of desolation and forgotten tragedies. As I drove, the autumn wind howled against the RV's metal frame, and the flickering of the dashboard lights seemed to mirror the uncertainty gnawing at my heart. I had no companions on this journey, only the ceaseless hum of the engine and the whisper of my own memories. Almost immediately, I began to notice that my RV was acting up. The radio, which had always been a comforting presence during long stretches of solitude, started emitting bursts of static interspersed with voices I couldn't quite decipher. At first, I chalked it up to the failing circuitry of an old machine, but soon the messages became disturbingly specific. Snatches of words that echoed my own doubts and regrets. One evening, as I fumbled with the dials trying to clear the interference, I found a crumpled photograph tucked behind the glove compartment. It was a picture of a young man with eyes full of life and sorrow. A face I felt I recognized from somewhere, though I couldn't place it at the time. The sense that someone had been in my RV before me unsettled me, as if an invisible presence was sharing in my solitude. That night, parked in a secluded clearing along the gorge, the atmosphere grew heavy and oppressive. I sat alone at a rickety table outside the RV, the cold seeping into my bones as I tried to sort through my jumbled thoughts. The static on the radio morphed into what sounded like an accusatory whisper, one that mirrored the voice of my own inner torment. I could almost hear it say, "You can't run from what you've done." Every creak of the RV and every rustle of the wind made my skin crawl, and I felt as though the very darkness around me was alive with judgment. A couple of nights later, during a violent downpour that blurred the lines between rain and tears, I witnessed something I can hardly explain. As I sat huddled under a threadbare blanket, trying to muster the courage to sleep, I saw a figure at the edge of the RV's weak beam of light. It was the spectral image of a young man, his eyes filled with an intense mix of sorrow and fury. The apparition was almost tangible, a presence that seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken accusations. I remember feeling a cold dread as his gaze met mine, a look that demanded I confront something I had long tried to bury. In that moment, the line between the living and the dead blurred, and I realized that my journey was no longer just about escaping my past. It had become a confrontation with it. One rainy evening, while I was pulling into a dilapidated rest stop off a forgotten side road, I encountered a grizzled old truck driver at a nearly abandoned fuel station. His face was weathered by years of hardship, and his eyes held a quiet, knowing sadness. He leaned over the pump and, in a low, gravelly tone, warned me, "These roads have a way of dredging up the past. Don't be surprised if you see more than just reflections in the headlights." I brushed off his words as the ramblings of an old man, yet his warning echoed in my mind as I continued on my solitary path. As days passed, the RV's malfunctions grew more frequent and inexplicable. Objects moved on their own. I discovered personal items, papers, a watch, even a set of keys, in places I was sure I had left them untouched, and always the radio continued to murmur, sometimes with eerie clarity, other times lost in a sea of static. The sense of isolation deepened until it was as though I were not alone in the vehicle or on the road. It was during one of these long, restless nights that I resolved to leave the relative safety of the RV and investigate the abandoned rest stop I had noticed earlier, a forgotten structure that seemed to pulsate with a silent, mournful energy. I stepped out into the chill of a moonless night, the only light coming from the dim glow of my RV's interior. The rest stop was a crumbling relic, its faded signs and broken windows telling stories of better days long past. As I approached, the wind seemed to carry whispers, a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others condemning. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The building was cavernous and empty, its interior bathed in a spectral light that made the air feel unnaturally cold. And there, in the midst of this desolation, he appeared, the ghost. He stood before me in the center of the room, a young man whose face was a mirror of regret and anguish. His eyes, deep and accusing, locked onto mine, and for a long, heart-stopping moment I felt as if he were peering into the darkest recesses of my soul. The silence that followed was broken by a sudden violent gust of wind that sent dust and debris swirling around us. In that moment, the ghost spoke, not in words, but in a torrent of emotions and images that crashed over me like a tidal wave. I saw flashes of my past, moments of failure and sorrow that I had tried so desperately to forget. His presence was overwhelming, as if every regret I had ever held was being forcefully dragged into the open. I tried to speak, to ask him what he wanted, but my voice was swallowed by the cacophony of memories and the sound of the wind. The ghost's eyes burned with a fury that was both otherworldly and deeply personal, and as he advanced, the room began to tremble. The very walls seemed to crack and groan under the weight of his silent accusations. Every image, every memory came rushing back. A case that went unsolved. A life that was lost due to my inaction. The heavy burden of guilt that had followed me for years. It was as if the ghost was demanding retribution for my failures. In that terrifying confrontation, I found myself unable to distinguish between the supernatural and the torment of my own mind. The physical sensations, shattering glass, splintering wood, the icy touch of the wind, merged with the intangible pain of regret. My heart pounded in my ears as I staggered backward, caught in a maelstrom of external chaos and internal despair. The ghost's silent fury was relentless, and I could feel my resolve crumbling under its weight. Every moment was a struggle, a battle not only against an apparition, but against the part of myself that had always refused to take responsibility for the past. Cornered and trembling in that dilapidated rest stop, I reached a breaking point. With a ragged cry, I admitted aloud the sins I had tried so desperately to bury. I confessed my failures, the guilt that had tormented me night after night, and the desperate need for forgiveness. The words spilled from me in a torrent of raw emotion, and as they filled the cold, empty room, something shifted. The relentless fury in the ghost's eyes softened, replaced by an overwhelming sadness that resonated deep within me. In that cathartic moment, the spectral figure hesitated, as if the very act of acknowledging my wrongs had weakened his hold on me. Slowly, imperceptibly, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The trembling of the walls ceased, and the biting cold receded into a mournful calm. The ghost's form, once so vivid and menacing, began to fade into the dim shadows of the abandoned rest stop. I stood there, shivering and exposed, as the silence returned. A silence that was heavy with the memory of my past, but also filled with a tentative promise of redemption. Returning to my RV, I found that the strange occurrences had subsided. The radio was quiet, and the inexplicable movements of objects had stopped. It was as if the confrontation had drawn a line between the torment of my memories and the possibility of moving forward. I wasn't free of guilt, nor were the scars of my past erased, but I felt lighter, as if I had faced the darkness and in doing so had begun to forgive myself. Now, as I continue along the winding roads of the Columbia River Gorge, the journey has taken on a new meaning. Each mile I travel is a step away from the haunting shadows of my former life and toward an uncertain yet hopeful future. The memory of that night, the spectral confrontation, the overwhelming rush of regret, and the quiet dissolution of the ghost remains etched in my mind as both a curse and a blessing. I understand now that some ghosts are not external forces but the manifestations of our deepest fears and regrets. And while they may haunt us relentlessly, confronting them is the only way to reclaim the light within. Even though I still travel alone, I no longer feel imprisoned by the past. I have learned that redemption is not an instantaneous miracle, but a gradual process, a road paved with the painful, necessary reckoning of our own inner demons. And so, with each passing mile and each breath of the cold, clear air, I move forward, carrying the lessons of that fateful night as both a reminder and a guide. The road ahead may still be treacherous, filled with unexpected twists and lingering shadows, but I now know that facing the darkness is the first step toward finding a way out. Every time the wind whispers through the pines or the fading light of dusk casts long shadows across the pavement, I pause and remember the ghost's sorrowful eyes and the weight of my own confession. In that memory lies both the terror of what I once was and the hope of what I can become. The journey is far from over, but for the first time in years, I feel ready to face whatever lies ahead on this endless road to reckoning. My name is Connor Matthews. I am 38 years old. This happened in the heart of the Willamet National Forest, near a forgotten clearing known as Timberline Camp, a place whispered about in local lore for its eerie legends and inexplicable tragedies. I had planned this RV adventure as an escape from my urban grind, a chance to reconnect with nature and, admittedly, test my wilderness survival skills honed during my years as a park ranger. I wasn't alone, though. Alongside me were 4 longtime friends: Julia Reyes, Mark Johnson, Fiona Clark, and Dave Reynolds. We set off in an old, creaking RV that I'd inherited from a relative, a relic that seemed more a testament to stubborn optimism than reliable engineering. From the moment we hit the road, we were reminded that nothing in life is as dependable as we'd like it to be. The GPS malfunctioned repeatedly. The headlights sputtered in the dusk, and even the locks on the RV felt as if they were waiting to fail. As we wound our way along narrow, twisting back roads, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Julia, our empathetic mediator, did her best to smooth over the rising tensions among us. She was always the one who knew the local legends, and her soft-spoken warnings about the area's dark history, whispers of shape-shifting creatures and cursed souls, set my nerves on edge. Mark, ever the skeptical realist, scoffed at such superstitions, his quick wit belying a deep, unspoken anxiety. Fiona, our impulsive thrill-seeker, wore excitement on her sleeve. She was the one who pushed for every detour and insisted we explore every rumored haunted nook, while Dave, quiet and observant, often noted the smallest details: the scratches on a tree trunk here, an odd footprint there. We finally arrived at Timberline Camp just as dusk draped the forest in shadows. The campsite was nestled near an abandoned ranger station that loomed like a relic of a forgotten past, its silent windows watching us with a melancholy air. I remembered the chill that ran down my spine as I stepped out of the RV, the night's air thick with anticipation and something unnameable. The first sign that something wasn't right came almost immediately. While setting up our small campfire, I noticed strange animal tracks near the perimeter, too large and irregular to belong to any common forest dweller. Not far from the RV, on a weathered tree, I found cryptic symbols carved deep into the bark, an unsettling combination of spirals and jagged lines that seemed almost ritualistic. As darkness deepened, the forest fell into an eerie silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, amidst that oppressive quiet, Fiona's voice pierced the night, a soft, almost pleading whisper calling her name. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I wondered if our imaginations were conjuring up the legends Julia had so carefully recounted. It wasn't long before we encountered our first true horror. The next morning, determined to shake off our unease, we set out on a forest hike along a trail that cut through towering pines and moss-laden undergrowth. As we walked, the sense of being watched grew more intense. Without warning, in a blink between the dense trees, a shadow flitted past our line of sight. I slowed my pace, heart hammering, when I saw it. A figure that seemed to flicker and twist before my eyes. Its face shifted unnervingly between a distorted semblance of human familiarity and something utterly monstrous. In that moment, I knew we were dealing with something far beyond mere folklore. The creature, which we later came to call the Hollow One, was a shape-shifting skinwalker, its presence heralded by the distorted echoes of voices that mimicked our own. In the days that followed, our situation deteriorated. The RV's equipment, already unreliable, began acting against us. Locks were mysteriously tampered with overnight, and our communication devices, phones, and even the emergency radio fell silent, as if the forest itself was determined to sever our ties with the outside world. Tempers flared. Mark's skepticism turned into angry outbursts as he accused me of underestimating the legends, while Fiona's reckless daring clashed with the more cautious voices among us. Julia tried, in vain, to keep us united. Her soft reassurances about local dangers only deepened our collective anxiety, and behind her calm exterior, I started noticing hints that she wasn't entirely forthright about her own connections in these parts. The turning point came during a violent, lashing thunderstorm one cold night. Torrential rain battered the RV, and the wind howled like the anguished cries of lost souls. Amidst the chaos of rattling windows and flickering lights, I stepped outside to check on our makeshift barricades, when I suddenly realized that Dave was missing. His belongings lay scattered on the ground. His worn backpack, a notebook filled with meticulous observations, and a half-drunk cup of coffee that had long since cooled. Panic seized me as I called out his name, my voice drowned by the roar of the storm. None of the others could explain his sudden disappearance. We combed the vicinity under the pall of rain, following faint, blood-curdling echoes and disturbed footprints that led toward a dense copse of trees. There, hidden in the gloom, we discovered a small, makeshift camp that wasn't part of our itinerary. The remnants of a fire, the telltale scent of burning herbs mixed with raw, coppery blood, and the shattered remains of a crude altar. All of it spoke of a dark underbelly we had never imagined. Among the scattered items I found a journal, its pages smeared with ink and dried blood. The entries detailed unspeakable torture rituals, sacrifices to an ancient malevolent force, the very entity we now knew as the Hollow One. And they spoke of a group, a cult of human traffickers and drug dealers who worshipped this shifting horror, kidnapping those who wandered too close to their clandestine lair for their grisly rites. The revelation hit us like a freight train. While we were reeling from the possibility that Dave had been kidnapped by this cult, a second, more insidious betrayal began to unravel the fragile bond that held our group together. In whispered conversations and furtive glances, it emerged that Julia had been in secret contact with the cult. Whether it was coercion or complicity, her half-truths and evasions now carried the weight of treachery. The discovery sent shockwaves through us. In that rain-soaked moment, our unity fractured. Accusations flew, and bitter divisions emerged. Some of us, driven by the desperate hope of rescuing Dave, argued that Julia's knowledge of the cult's whereabouts might be our only way to get him back. Others, filled with righteous fury, demanded immediate retribution against her. Unable to reach a consensus, our group splintered into factions. The storm, relentless and unforgiving, masked the sounds of our bitter quarrels and the slow, insidious encroachment of the forest's darkness. It wasn't long before our fractured resolve was put to the ultimate test. Under the cloak of a new, relentless downpour, we set off toward the location hinted at in the journal, a clearing deep within the forest where the cult was said to convene. Our journey was fraught with peril from the start. The Hollow One seemed to toy with us, its eerie mimicry of our voices sowing confusion and terror. In moments of desperate clarity, I recalled stories of how this creature exploited isolation, using our own fears against us. I could hear its laughter. Or was it my own voice, distorted and cruel, whispering in the wind, spurring us deeper into a nightmare? At the clearing, hidden beneath a canopy of ancient, gnarled trees, we found the cult's stronghold. The camp was a chaotic sprawl of crude wooden structures, flickering torches, and masked figures moving with unsettling precision. The air was heavy with the stench of burning incense, herbs, and something far fouler, raw, disturbed earth mixed with decay. We watched from the shadows, hearts pounding in unison as we formulated a rescue plan for Dave. It was then that the full extent of our peril revealed itself. Local law enforcement, corrupt and in league with the cult, emerged from the darkness. They were as ruthless as the cultists, armed and determined to silence any interference. A violent confrontation erupted almost immediately. The clearing became a battleground. Shouts, gunfire, and the clash of fists echoed among the trees. I found myself locked in hand-to-hand combat with a grim-faced deputy, his eyes devoid of humanity. In the chaos, Mark, ever the skeptic, drew his weapon and, with a fierce determination, created a diversion to allow some of us to break through the cult's defenses. But violence has a cost. As the skirmish reached its apex, Fiona was struck by a bullet that tore through her side. The pain was excruciating, and I rushed to her, desperate to staunch the bleeding. Her eyes met mine in silent agony, a wordless plea for survival. In that moment, the dream of a simple escape had transformed into a brutal fight for life. Amid the firefight, the cultists and their law enforcement allies began to focus on us as a single, dangerous unit. I could see the terror in the eyes of my friends, and I knew that if we didn't act swiftly, we would all pay the ultimate price. With a deep, resolute breath, I rallied those who remained, urging them to fight not just for Dave, but for every soul ensnared by this nightmare. We pressed forward, using every scrap of skill and courage we possessed, fueled by the desperate hope of rescuing our friend. In the ensuing melee, amidst the torrential rain and the cacophony of violence, I managed to break away and penetrate the heart of the cult's stronghold. There, in a makeshift cell, I found Dave, wounded, terrified, but alive. His eyes, wide with horror, told me of the unspeakable torture he had endured. Rituals meant to appease the Hollow One, crude instruments of pain, and a relentless barrage of terror. I helped him to his feet, our escape a frantic dash through the labyrinth of burning tents and shadowy figures. As we fled, chaos reigned. In the midst of our desperate retreat, Mark, ever the skeptic who had become our shield, sacrificed himself. I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he turned to cover our escape, a final act of defiance against the darkness that had consumed us. His sacrifice stung like a raw wound, a reminder of the heavy cost of our intrusion into this forsaken place. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a forest eerily silent and drenched in an unsettling calm. We managed to regroup at our battered RV, the night's events replaying in our minds like a waking nightmare. Fiona's injuries were severe, and as we tried to administer what little first aid we could, the cold realization set in. Our once united group was irrevocably shattered. And then, as if the night hadn't already taken enough, Julia vanished into the darkness. In the confusion of our escape, she disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the bitter taste of betrayal and questions that would haunt us long after we left the forest. I now sit in a temporary safe house on the outskirts of a small town, the memories of that night etched deep into my soul. Dave is alive, though forever marked by his ordeal. Fiona clings to life, her recovery uncertain, and Mark's sacrifice, as heroic as it was tragic, reverberates through every quiet moment. The Hollow One remains an enigma, a dark force that exploited our weaknesses, turning friend against friend and faith into fear. The experience shattered my notions of safety and camaraderie. The isolation of the forest, the relentless assault of nature and human cruelty, and the supernatural terror we encountered have left me questioning everything I once believed about the world. I know now that survival is not just about physical endurance, but about the strength to face betrayal and the courage to confront the darkest aspects of our own souls. In the aftermath, I have tried to piece together the fragments of that terrible night, but some mysteries remain unsolved. The corrupt authorities, the cult's true reach, and Julia's ultimate fate all linger like ghosts in my mind. I sometimes wonder if the Hollow One was merely a manifestation of the deep-seated evils hidden within us all, or if it was a malevolent force beyond human comprehension. Either way, the scars it left behind are indelible. As I write this, the forest looms in my memories like a living nightmare, a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are not the monsters we imagine, but the darkness that resides within our own hearts. I share my story not as a confession, but as a warning. When you venture into the unknown, be prepared to confront not only the terrors that stalk the wilderness, but also the betrayal and violence that lie hidden in the souls of those you trust. Every night, I still hear the echoes of that fateful storm, the anguished cries of Mark's final stand, and the whispered promises of the Hollow One. And though I may never find solace, I continue forward, carrying the heavy burden of a truth that is as inescapable as the darkness of the Willamet forest. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 42 years old. This happened when I decided to leave behind the crushing guilt and grief of losing my wife and set off alone in my battered RV through Hamut Hood National Forest, Oregon. I'd hoped that a solitary journey might offer the solace and answers I so desperately sought, but nothing could have prepared me for the unsettling truths the forest held. From the moment I hit the road, my RV, an old, rusted relic, seemed to mirror the chaos in my soul. The engine sputtered unexpectedly. Tires suffered inexplicable damage on rough, unmarked trails, and the electrical system played tricks with flickering lights that made the interior feel less like a safe haven and more like a stage for something unworldly. I couldn't shake the notion that these malfunctions were no mere coincidence. It was as if the forest itself was warning me that escape from my past was impossible. Driving along desolate forest roads, I began noticing things that made my heart race in both terror and longing. Shadows danced at the periphery of my vision, and soft, almost imperceptible whispers carried on the wind made me pause and listen. Several times, I caught a glimpse of a woman whose features were achingly familiar, so much so that I couldn't ignore the possibility that it was my wife's spirit. The apparitions were bittersweet, a comforting reminder of the love I had lost, yet an accusation that I had left her behind. My mind, already frayed by sorrow, wondered if these were just hallucinations born of loneliness, or if something else was reaching out to me from the other side. One chilly afternoon, as the sun dipped behind towering pines, I pulled over at a remote forest lookout. There, I met a park ranger named Sarah. Her presence was calming, though her eyes held a depth of understanding that belied the simple uniform she wore. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Ethan," she said quietly, as though she'd known my name all along. She spoke in hushed tones about the forest's tragic past, of lost souls and inexplicable disappearances, and hinted at a strange energy that dwelled among the trees. Her words, cryptic and measured, stirred up memories I'd tried to suppress, and planted seeds of doubt about whether my spectral encounters were simply figments of a grief-stricken mind. I couldn't shake the pull that led me further into the heart of the forest. Rumors and old local records mentioned an abandoned cabin, a forlorn structure hidden deep within the woods that had once been a refuge for those seeking to escape life's burdens. They said it was a crossroads between the past and the present, a place where the echoes of old tragedies still lingered. Despite the RV's persistent breakdowns and the increasing eeriness of my surroundings, I knew I had to find that cabin. Somewhere in its decrepit walls, I hoped, lay the answers to the tumult that raged within me. After days of navigating winding roads and broken trails, I finally reached a clearing shrouded in mist. There, almost as if waiting for me, stood the abandoned cabin. Its weathered wooden walls bore the scars of time and sorrow, and a palpable silence hung over the structure. I parked the RV a safe distance away and approached the cabin with a mix of dread and anticipation. The door creaked open to reveal a musty interior, cluttered with relics of a life long past. Faded photographs, scattered mementos, and, most striking of all, a leather-bound journal resting on a rickety table. I sat down and began leafing through the journal. The entries were a tapestry of despair and mystery. Tales of inexplicable deaths, vanishing wanderers, and spectral figures whose mournful cries haunted the nights. One entry, in particular, recounted the appearance of a loving apparition that both comforted and condemned its beholders, a presence that bore an uncanny resemblance to the one I had seen on the road. As I read, my pulse quickened with a mixture of terror and a strange sense of recognition. It was as if the cabin, and all its haunted history, was intertwined with my own tragedy. That night, a violent storm descended upon the forest. Rain pounded the cabin's broken windows, and the wind howled like a chorus of sorrowful spirits. I huddled in the dim light of a single, sputtering candle, the journal spread open before me as if urging me to confront the memories I had long tried to escape. With every crash of thunder, I felt the walls of the cabin tremble, not just from the force of nature, but from the weight of my own suppressed guilt and regret. In the midst of the storm, as lightning illuminated the warped shadows around me, I heard a sound that froze my blood. A soft, deliberate set of footsteps outside. My breath caught when, through a gap in the broken window, I saw her, the apparition of my wife. There she stood, bathed in the eerie glow of the tempest, her face a heartbreaking blend of tenderness and reproach. For a long, agonizing moment, the spectral image held me captive. Her eyes, full of a sorrow I recognized all too well, seemed to ask, "Why did you leave me behind?" The question struck me like a physical blow. The memory of that tragic day, the moment I lost her forever, surged back with unbearable force. I felt my defenses crumble as her ghostly voice, soft yet piercing, echoed through the howling wind. It wasn't merely a reminder of loss, it was a condemnation. an accusation that forced me to face the reality of my failure to protect her. Before I could fully succumb to the overwhelming grief, I sensed another presence beside me, a figure emerging from the shadows, ethereal yet unmistakably real. It was Sarah, the park ranger I had met earlier, yet now, in the flickering candlelight and the chaos of the storm, she seemed both more real and more spectral than ever. "You cannot run from the past, Ethan," she whispered, her tone gentle but firm. "Only by facing it can you find the redemption you seek." Her words mingled with the relentless patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder, urging me to confront the unresolved pain that had plagued me for so long. For hours that felt like an eternity, I sat in the solitary gloom of that cursed cabin. I listened to the storm and the soft, shifting murmurs that might have been the wind, or perhaps the echo of memories too potent to dismiss. The apparition of my wife flickered in and out of view, sometimes offering a semblance of comfort, other times filling the room with accusatory silence. I felt as though I were engaged in a surreal battle, a confrontation not with an external monster, but with the very essence of my own grief and guilt. Every flash of lightning illuminated dark corners of the cabin, each burst of thunder a stark reminder of the day I lost everything. The journal's pages, stained with the ink of despair and sorrow, spoke of lives ruined by secrets and tragedies that had long since been buried by time. I realized then that the cabin was more than a relic. It was a crucible where the past and present coalesced, forcing me to reckon with my own demons. As the storm began to subside and the first hints of dawn crept through the fractured windows, the spectral images faded into the gentle gray light. The apparition of my wife vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving me alone with the bitter residue of her message. I sat there, feeling both utterly broken and strangely liberated. In that harrowing night, I had been forced to confront the darkest parts of my soul, the guilt that had chained me to the memory of loss, the relentless grief that had refused to let me move on. I knew then that I could not remain in that haunted haven. The abandoned cabin, with its layers of sorrow and spectral echoes, had shown me that redemption was not found in escape, but in acceptance. I gathered the journal and a few precious mementos, knowing that though the past would always be a part of me, I could no longer allow it to define my future. Starting the RV, now a weary yet resolute companion, I set off into the misty morning. The engine's low rumble seemed less a sign of impending doom and more an acknowledgement of the journey ahead. A journey not just through the tangled roads of Mount Hood National Forest, but through the labyrinth of my own heart. I left behind the cabin and its sorrowful relics, carrying with me the lessons of that long, stormy night. Every mile I put between myself and that place brought a tentative hope that someday I might find the redemption I had been seeking. I understood that the spectral visits, the warnings of a park ranger who might have been more spirit than flesh, and the unyielding grip of the forest on my soul were all manifestations of a truth I could no longer ignore. The ghosts of the past must be faced, not forgotten. Now, as I drive down a lonely forest road with the morning light breaking through the treetops, I feel the bitter-sweet pull of memory and the steady, if fragile, promise of renewal. The image of my wife, both comforting and condemning, lingers at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder of what I lost and what I must ultimately learn to forgive. In that vast, haunted wilderness, I have come to understand that redemption is not a destination, but a continuous journey. A slow, arduous process of confronting the darkness within and, step by painful step, moving toward the light. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, or if the forest will continue to whisper its ancient secrets to me, but for the first time in a long while, I feel that I might just have the strength to keep moving forward. My past will forever be a part of me, but it no longer defines me. With every mile I drive, I leave behind fragments of a sorrowful history and forge a new path, one where the ghosts of yesterday become guides for tomorrow, rather than chains that bind me to endless regret. My name is Nina Santos. I'm 34 years old. This happened when I left Portland in my old converted RV van, determined to unravel the mystery of Lost Prospect, a forsaken mining camp deep in the Rogue River, Siskiyou National Forest, Oregon. I had spent years chasing leads about my missing father, a man swallowed by the shadows of local legend, and nothing was going to stop me now. Not even an RV that groaned with every mile, and a sky that seemed to warn me with dark, roiling clouds. The journey was fraught with little omens from the start. The engine sputtered on uneven back roads, and every bump in the pavement made my stomach clench. The weather was as unpredictable as the rumors I'd heard, sudden downpours and an eerie mist that swallowed the horizon. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in these woods was deliberately trying to keep its secrets hidden. Still, my resolve only grew stronger. I needed answers about my father, and I was prepared to risk everything to find them. After hours of battling winding, poorly maintained roads and persistent mechanical hiccups, I finally pulled into the clearing where Lost Prospect lay. The camp was a ghost town, a scattered array of abandoned cabins, rusted mining equipment half buried in tangled weeds, and faded signs proclaiming a once thriving settlement. The silence was profound and oppressive, as though the land itself mourned a long-forgotten tragedy. Every step I took sent a chill through my veins. I spent the first day exploring the perimeter of the camp. While wandering among crumbling stone walls and splintered wooden structures, I noticed strange markings etched into the weathered rock. They looked like symbols, almost ritualistic in nature, and they were paired with eerie graffiti scrawled in faded, desperate hand. Then, in the distance, I began hearing an intermittent, rhythmic tapping that echoed like a miner's pickaxe. At first, I dismissed it as the wind against metal, but the consistency of the sound sent shivers down my spine. I recorded these details on my phone, hoping to compare them with local accounts later. Later that afternoon, near an old supply shed on the outskirts of the camp, I met Jake Morale, a local historian whose face bore the wear of many winters spent guarding the forest's secrets. He was gruff and cautious, his eyes wary as they took in my presence. "You shouldn't be here, Nina," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Lost Prospect isn't just an old ghost story. There are forces here that you don't want to stir up." His tone was part warning, part plea. I pressed him for more details about the legends, about any connection he might have to my father's disappearance, but Jake only offered fragmented hints. Stories of a cursed prospector, betrayed by his partners, whose vengeful spirit still roams these ruins, exacting retribution on anyone foolish enough to dig too deep. Despite his warnings, my determination remained unshaken. I thanked Jake with a nod, though his somber gaze lingered long after we parted ways. I pressed on, exploring deeper into the heart of the camp, drawn by an insatiable curiosity and the hope that I might uncover clues about my father's fate. Night fell rapidly as a violent storm rolled in, the sky unleashing sheets of rain that battered the old structures and sent the forest into a frenzy. Back in my RV van, I tried to start the engine, only to be met with a series of electrical malfunctions. The lights flickered erratically and the engine stalled repeatedly. My communications equipment failed to connect to any signal, leaving me utterly isolated. The oppressive atmosphere seeped into my bones as I sat alone, the wind howling like the tormented voices of the past. I knew I couldn't wait out the storm inside the RV. Something urged me to seek shelter in a more stable structure. With only a flashlight and my voice recorder as companions, I grabbed my coat and headed toward an old mine shaft on the edge of the camp. The entrance was partially collapsed, its darkness inviting and menacing all at once. Inside the mine, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of rust and decay. As I ventured deeper, the rhythmic tapping I had heard earlier grew louder, echoing off the rough walls. Every step I took was accompanied by an almost imperceptible sound, the persistent, haunting clack of a pickaxe. I reached a chamber where the beam of my flashlight fell upon a figure that made my blood run cold. There, standing amid the rubble of the old mining operations, was the spectral form of the cursed prospector. His appearance was ghastly. A gaunt figure draped in a tattered miner's jacket, his eyes glowing with a supernatural intensity that pierced the darkness. The sound of his pickaxe, echoing as if in slow motion, reverberated through the chamber. He muttered indistinctly, his words laced with betrayal and sorrow. I couldn't tell if he was cursing his past or warning me of a future steeped in misery. For a long, heart-stopping moment, we simply regarded each other. I felt an overwhelming mix of fear and pity, a sense that this tortured soul was both a victim and a harbinger of doom. His presence shattered the veneer of skepticism I had clung to, replacing it with a raw, primal terror that left me momentarily paralyzed. I managed to record his murmurs, the broken sentences hinting at vengeance and broken promises, before the apparition faded into the darkness, leaving me alone with the pounding of my heart and the echo of his spectral pickaxe. The encounter was just the beginning. The storm outside intensified, and with it, my isolation deepened. Every piece of equipment in my RV van began to fail. The lights danced wildly, the engine coughed, and my navigation system blinked out as if surrendering to the oppressive will of the forest. I found myself trapped, both physically by the relentless weather and mentally by the knowledge of what I had witnessed. Determined not to let terror drive me away from the truth, I ventured back into the ruins, drawn to the skeletal remains of the mining camp. The wind carried whispers that seemed to murmur my name, and shadowy figures flickered at the edge of my vision. Flashbacks of childhood memories, of my father telling me stories about the rugged pioneers and their bitter feuds, merged with the present horror. I recalled his face, etched with hope and despair, and wondered if his fate had been sealed by the very curse I now faced. The confrontation came in a moment of blinding lightning. In the center of the camp, as thunder shook the ground and rain turned the earth to mud, the ghost of the cursed prospector reappeared with a ferocity that left me reeling. His form seemed to swell with anger, the spectral glow of his eyes intensifying as he advanced toward me. I could feel the weight of his vengeance pressing in, his voice now a roar of accusation that filled the torrential night. In that terrifying showdown, I felt as though every unresolved grief, every desperate search for answers about my father, was culminating in this single, harrowing encounter. I fought to keep my footing on the slippery ground, dodging both the physical debris and the intangible assaults of the ghost's wrath. My voice recorder captured my frantic murmurs as I pleaded for mercy from a spirit who, in its tormented existence, seemed as much a victim of past betrayal as it was a force of retribution. The struggle blurred into a chaotic dance of flashes, echoes, and raw emotion. I realized that my relentless pursuit of truth had led me into a trap of supernatural fury and personal torment. In the midst of the tempest, with the cursed prospector's ghastly form looming over me, I knew I had to break free, if only to live another day and continue my search for the truth about my father. With a burst of adrenaline, I managed to stagger away from the spectral figure, each step a battle against the searing pain of both fear and grief. I barely recall how I escaped the clutches of that vengeful spirit. The world had become a blur of rain, lightning, and heart-pounding dread. When I finally reached the relative safety of my RV van, I slumped against its battered side, shivering not just from the cold, but from the realization that some mysteries come at an unbearable cost. The storm eventually relented, leaving behind a shattered landscape and a trail of unanswered questions. I spent the next few hours in the RV, recording my thoughts and the fragments of the experience, each word heavy with the weight of loss and the bitter price of my curiosity. I was left with unsettling evidence, the ghost's mutterings, the inexplicable markings on the rock, and my own battered state, as a reminder that my father's disappearance might be irrevocably tied to the curse of Lost Prospect. I left the mining camp as dawn broke, the sky a tentative promise of clarity. But even as I drove away, the darkness of that night clung to me like a shadow. My final recordings, filled with a mix of raw terror and reluctant acceptance, hinted at deeper mysteries, of a legacy tainted by betrayal and a curse that defied the passage of time. I couldn't help but wonder if the spirit of the cursed prospector was a warning to all who dared to pry into secrets meant to remain buried. Now, as I travel back toward Portland, the roads seem quieter and the forest less ominous. Yet the memory of Lost Prospect and the price of my relentless curiosity remains indelibly etched in my mind. I have learned that some truths are not only dangerous but transformative, forcing us to confront the shadows of our past and the ghosts we carry within our souls. Though I may never have all the answers about my father or the curse that haunts this desolate place, I know one thing for sure. The quest for truth can exact a price that no one is ever truly prepared to pay. Every time I pass a dark, foggy stretch of road or hear the faint echo of a pickaxe in the distance, I remember that night. I remember the vengeful eyes of the cursed prospector, the storm that tore through Lost Prospect, and the harsh lesson that sometimes the allure of uncovering hidden truths can lead us straight into the jaws of darkness. And while I continue my search for answers, I now do so with a cautious respect for the mysteries that lie hidden in the ruins of the past, a reminder that some secrets, once awakened, might never let you go. My name is Aaron Hayes, and this happened when I was 28. Some things should remain forgotten, buried in the solitude of the forest. But here I am, trying to put it all down before the lingering terror consumes what little peace I have left. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing weekend getaway. A time for the four of us to escape our hectic lives. No cell service, no work emails, just the open road and the wilderness. My best friends, Carl, Becca, and Dana, all packed into my old RV, and we headed for the Willamet National Forest in western Oregon. We were looking for a remote spot near Mackenzie River, an area known for its quiet solitude. We needed it. I needed it. Carl, as usual, was ultra excited, practically bouncing in the back of the RV, talking about hiking to the nearest waterfall. Becca, always the voice of reason, was quietly mapping the route and double-checking every item on our list. Dana was just there. Maybe distant was a better word. She was more the quiet type, sensitive but withdrawn, and she had this energy about her, like she was always on the verge of something. I noticed it that morning when she refused to leave her seat, staring out the window instead of engaging with the conversation. We arrived at the campground well after dark. The wind picked up, rustling through the towering pine trees like some terrible lullaby. It had a damp smell to it. Musty earth, leaves, and whatever unknown creatures were lurking just out of sight. We set up camp quickly, as Carl insisted we explore right away, but Becca's cautious nature took over. "This place feels weird," she said, glancing around nervously. "Just the wind." Carl dismissed her concern, going back to adjusting the gear. "Let's get out there, look at the stars." I thought it was a stupid idea too, but I wasn't about to be the buzzkill. So far, everything was fine. Just some unsettled tension in the air, no big deal. The first sign that something wasn't right came when Becca found the symbols. We'd split up. Carl was off doing his own thing, as usual, and Dana, Becca, and I were walking down one of the small trails that snaked around the edge of the forest. The sounds of the woods had fallen unnaturally quiet now, and I'd noticed an odd coldness creeping in, even though it wasn't particularly chilly. It was Dana who first stopped, squatting down near the base of a tree. "Huh," she murmured, brushing her fingers over the rough bark. "What's up?" I asked. She stood slowly, her face pale. "There are scratches, symbols, on this tree." I looked, and indeed the trunk was covered in crude markings, shapes and lines etched deep into the bark. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before, maybe pseudo-tribal markings, but they were wrong, too fresh for something ancient. It gave off a bad energy. "We should go back," Becca insisted. But Carl had disappeared by now, off chasing whatever hallucination got his foot in the door. He was always like that, pushing boundaries, ignoring every warning until it was too late. That night, as we made dinner in the RV, the lights flickered once or twice. The sudden power loss seemed like a coincidence, just an old RV acting up. But the second time it happened, something about the air felt thick, stifling. Dana had grown almost unreasonably quiet, her eyes darting about like she felt something I couldn't see. We finished our meal in uncomfortable silence before we all bedded down for the night. The sounds of the forest were loud enough to be worrying, but what really chilled me to the bone wasn't the rustling of animals. It occurred after I turned out the lights. A low, steady growl from the woods just beyond our camp. I hoped it was just some wild animal, but I wasn't sure. The growl didn't end. It lingered, drawing closer, until it stopped entirely, lasting silence after that. Too perfect, too unnatural. I think I heard a twig snap outside, or maybe it was something else, something worse. By morning, Carl was gone. His sleeping bag was still loosely rolled up, a scattering of garbage by the door. His boots, too, were left behind. But Carl himself, no trace. The restless man who never sat still for long had vanished, leaving behind no sign aside from his abandoned things. We found his trail leading off into the woods, winding through the trees. Broken branches, scattered prints. At one point, I could have sworn I heard him calling back, faintly, but on the wind there were no voices, only the distant cawing of crows. I called out for him until my throat was raw, but the only answer was the rustling of the underbrush and a deep, ominous moan from somewhere far off. We found them hours later. Bloodstains on the ground marked the site of whatever struggle had taken place. A torn jacket, a boot, half submerged in the dirt. Carl's. Pack, caught on a branch, its contents spilled across the forest floor. But Carl himself, nowhere to be found. By now, the air was thick with dread. Dana hadn't spoken much, but her blank stare at the edge of the woods wasn't comforting. "We need to go back," Becca urged. "This is it. This is some bullshit." But I refused to leave. Complete abandonment had never been an option in my mind. We couldn't just leave, with Carl still out there, and then, "Dana," she snapped. It was so subtle at first, but then it got bad. Dana had started wandering off at odd hours, constantly pacing in a strange daze, standing in front of the RV for hours, lost in an unfocused stare. The night Dana disappeared started like any other, falling asleep in the quiet, hearing wolves in the distance. I awoke to a noise, a thud by the door, and then, right before I could react, a shadow loomed close to the window. I grabbed a rifle from the overhead shelf and slowly crept to the door. Becca was still asleep, breathing softly. I swung open the RV door, and in one glance I saw Dana. Standing there, barefoot, her eyes wide and unseeing, glowing under the weak moonlight. It was the way her face looked, though. It wasn't her. It was a twist of her features. It was like something was consuming her from the inside, a twisted version, a vessel for something else. She didn't look human anymore. She didn't look in my direction. She didn't even flinch. But next, my soul fractured. The shriek. A banshee-like wail tearing through the night from the very woods where we'd lost Carl. I tried calling her back, but it was useless. She was gone. Everything from that point became a blur. The rest of the night was pure chaos. Becca and I searched the woods until blood dripped from our feet, trying to find Dana, trying to find Carl. Every shadow was part of something more terrible. Ritualistic symbols on tree trunks, twisted branches growing inward as if entrapping us, distant figures watching us from between the thicket, and then the sound of something dragging. We ran. The creature, whatever it was, mimicked us, playing with us. And at the end of it, as dawn touched the treetops, I could see it, the skinwalker, in Carl's form. Carl, or what was left of him, was standing in front, watching me with empty eyes. "You're next," and then everything went black. Por 16 segundos. My name is Aaron Hayes. I'm 32 years old. This happened one chilly October weekend when my friends and I set out for a long-awaited RV getaway into the wilds of western Oregon. We'd all been worn down by the relentless grind of city life, and the promise of isolation near the Mackenzie River in the Willamet National Forest seemed like the perfect escape. I, being the de facto planner of our little group, had meticulously mapped our route. Alongside me were Becca Thompson, practical, resourceful, and the voice of reason, and two others. Carl Martinez, our charismatic thrill-seeker whose bravado often masked a deep-seated insecurity, and Dana Rivers, quiet and sensitive, always alert to the subtleties of the world around her. We piled into my aging RV, its engine grumbling a warning that we'd soon learn to heed. The first day was deceptively ordinary. We laughed and reminisced as we drove along winding roads bordered by towering evergreens. But as dusk settled over a remote clearing near the Mackenzie River, the RV's engine sputtered ominously. I cursed under my breath as I realized our rig was far older than any of us cared to admit, and now, in the middle of nowhere, it began to falter. That first night, the forest revealed its darker side. I sat outside on a rickety folding chair with a lukewarm cup of coffee, trying to ignore the chill that wasn't entirely due to the falling temperature. In the periphery of my vision, I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of an old pine, a series of twisted, almost unrecognizable marks that pulsed with an eerie significance. The silence was broken by low, unsettling whispers carried on the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from beyond the tree line. The next morning, the air was heavy with unease. While we attempted to diagnose the RV's problems, Dana's voice trembled as she mentioned hearing voices the night before. They were saying something like, "Follow the path," she murmured, eyes wide and fearful. I exchanged a worried glance with Becca, whose pragmatic nature usually dismissed such things as nerves. Yet even she couldn't ignore the chill in her voice. Our day took a turn for the worse during a hike along a narrow, wooded trail. We'd agreed to split up briefly. Carl insisted on taking a detour to get a better view of the river bend, and despite my reservations, we let him go off the main trail. I remember hearing his excited shouts fade into an eerie silence. When we returned to the campsite, he was nowhere to be found. Instead, we discovered torn fabric snagged on a low branch, smeared with dark stains that looked too much like blood. Panic set in. As the hours passed in frantic searching, tensions simmered among us. Carl's disappearance had fractured our fragile sense of safety. While Becca argued that we should return to civilization immediately, Dana, her face pale and eyes distant, insisted she knew a safer route. "There's a path beyond the ridge," she whispered, as if the words were coming from someplace else. Against my better judgment, we allowed Dana to guide us, hoping her intuition might lead us to Carl, or at least to a place where we could call for help. The forest seemed to grow denser as we followed her down a barely discernible trail. Shadows twisted in unnatural shapes between the trees, and the once familiar sounds of wildlife were replaced by an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves. It wasn't long before I noticed something was terribly off. The trees here bore the same inexplicable carvings as the ones near our RV, and a nauseating stench permeated the air, like decay mixed with earth. It was then that the unthinkable happened. Out of the dim gloom, a group of figures emerged, rough, hardened locals whose eyes held a predatory gleam. I recognized them from hushed rumors, a band of misfits rumored to be involved in cannibalistic cult rituals and unspeakable crimes. Before we could react, they descended upon us with brutal efficiency. I remember the sudden impact, a searing pain as I was shoved against a tree, the world spinning in a haze of confusion. Amid the chaos, I saw Becca struggling fiercely, her eyes flashing with defiance as she tried to fend off one of the attackers. And then, in the midst of the turmoil, Dana stepped back, her expression blank, as if she were no longer present. It was as if she had become one of them, or something worse, a puppet of a dark force that lurked in these woods. I fought to regain my footing as the attackers dragged Becca away. Shouts, curses, and the sickening sound of breaking branches filled the air as I staggered after them. I called out for Carl, desperate for any sign of my missing friend, but only silence answered. The forest swallowed our cries. In a desperate bid to escape, I broke into a run, my heart pounding as fiercely as the drumming rain that began to fall. But the forest was a labyrinth, and every turn seemed to lead me further from safety. At one point, I stumbled upon an abandoned shack that appeared to have been used as a makeshift holding area. Through a grimy window, I caught a glimpse of Becca, bound and bruised, as shadowy figures circled her like vultures. Their voices were low and guttural, and among them, I distinctly heard a rasping whisper, almost as if one of them was speaking with a voice not entirely human. My mind raced as I tried to piece together the horror unfolding before me. The local group had clearly succumbed to a malevolent influence, and I suspected that the true architect of this nightmare was none other than the skinwalker, a shape-shifting entity from local indigenous lore that had been hinted at in whispered warnings and eerie sightings. This creature, known to assume the appearance of those we trusted, had been playing us like marionettes. I resolved then to rescue Becca. Hiding in the shadows of the dilapidated shack, I observed my assailants. Their movements were methodical, almost ritualistic, as they administered brutal punishments to their captive. The sight of Becca, her eyes defiant despite her agony, steeled my resolve. I could not, would not, let her suffer at the hands of these monsters. Gathering what little strength I had left, I crept away from the shack and began to plot my next move. I knew that direct confrontation would be suicide, so I retraced my steps to the main trail, hoping to find an alternate route or even a way to contact help. But every step was laden with dread. The forest itself seemed to conspire against me. The deeper I went, the more the unnatural symbols appeared, and the sound of distant, mocking laughter echoed on the wind. In the darkness, the whispers returned. This time, louder, more insistent. They spoke of betrayal and doom, of a soul sacrificed for forbidden power. And then I saw her, Dana, standing on a ridge, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a makeshift fire. Her eyes, once gentle and kind, now shone with a predatory gleam. It hit me like a physical blow. She had led us here. Whether through possession or deliberate betrayal, Dana had conspired with our attackers. Her voice was soft and almost hypnotic as she called out, "Aaron, this way. I can help you rescue her." The sound was chilling in its dissonance with the terror of the situation. Torn between anger and desperate hope, I followed her, all the while feeling the sinister weight of the skinwalker's presence lurking at the edges of my vision. Dana led me along a narrow, twisting trail until we reached a small clearing. There, the remnants of our abduction lay scattered. Torn fabric, broken branches, and the unmistakable smell of blood. She paused, her gaze fixed on the dark undergrowth as if expecting an ambush. "They've taken her," she whispered, voice trembling with a strange mix of sorrow and malice. "And now, you must choose. Do you follow your heart or your fear?" I demanded answers, but before I could speak, a shout rang out from behind us. In that moment, a group of our attackers, more numerous and feral than before, emerged from the trees. The ensuing struggle was a blur of fists, screams, and the sound of splintering wood. I fought with every ounce of strength, fueled by the desperate need to save Becca. But amid the chaos, Dana's form shifted. For a split second, her features twisted into something monstrous. A flash of eyes too dark, a grin too wide, and then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The brutality of the attack left me battered and bleeding. I managed to fend off one of the attackers with a sharp piece of rebar, but the overwhelming force drove me back. In the ensuing melee, I caught a glimpse of Becca being dragged deeper into the forest. With a cry that mingled anguish and determination, I surged after them, adrenaline drowning out the pain. For what felt like hours, I chased through the forest, the rain blurring my vision and turning the ground into a treacherous mire. My lungs burned, and every step threatened to be my last, but the thought of Becca's terrified eyes kept me moving. Finally, I arrived at a clearing lit by a pale, sickly moon. There, in a makeshift wooden structure that reeked of decay, I saw her, bound to a rickety chair, blood staining her arms, her spirit unbroken despite the evident torment. Before I could reach her, a hand gripped my shoulder from behind. I spun around to confront a hulking figure whose eyes burned with an otherworldly fury. The man's voice was a low growl as he hissed, "You should not have come here." The confrontation was brutal. We struggled fiercely, the sounds of our scuffle merging with the relentless whispers of the forest. In that desperate moment, the rain mingled with my tears, and I fought not only for my life but for every friend I had lost. When the struggle reached its peak, a flash of lightning revealed more attackers surrounding us. Silent, relentless, their intentions clear. In that maelstrom of violence, I managed to knock the hulking figure aside, breaking free long enough to dash to Becca's side. "Hold on, Becca," I rasped, untying her as the attackers closed in. Her eyes met mine, filled with pain and quiet determination. I dragged her away, sprinting through the rain-soaked forest, the sounds of our pursuers echoing ominously behind us. Every instinct screamed that we were being herded into a trap. Yet I could not let go of the hope that salvation lay just beyond the next bend. I don't recall how long we ran. Time lost all meaning as the forest morphed into a nightmarish maze of twisting paths and looming shadows. Finally, exhausted and injured, we burst onto a narrow dirt road. The distant hum of an engine stirred a flicker of hope within me. With trembling hands, I flagged down a passing truck, and we were soon whisked away from that cursed place. In the sterile light of a roadside motel room, as I tended to my wounds and tried to piece together the shattered remnants of my mind, questions tormented me. What had happened to Carl? What dark force had possessed Dana, turning her into an agent of our downfall? And most haunting of all, how could a creature, a skinwalker that thrived on fear and betrayal, have infiltrated our lives so insidiously? I learned later from a terse police report that our attackers were part of a local cult known for their ritualistic violence and human trafficking. Their presence in the area had been a whispered legend among locals, dismissed by outsiders as myth until that horrifying weekend made it all too real. But no matter how many questions were answered by the authorities, the deeper mysteries remained shrouded in darkness. Dana was never found, and Carl's disappearance was ruled as an unresolved missing person case. In my heart, I knew that the true horror was far from over. Every time I close my eyes, I see the twisted symbols on the trees, hear the mocking laughter of those attackers, and feel the cold, calculating gaze of a creature that wore the face of a friend. The skinwalker's legacy of betrayal, violence, and unspeakable terror has scarred me in ways that no wound can heal. Now, whenever the wind rustles the leaves or a shadow shifts at the corner of my vision, I'm reminded that the wilderness holds secrets best left undisturbed. And as I navigate the fragile boundary between survival and the darkness that lurks just beyond, I know that some nightmares refuse to die. I am Aaron Hayes, and though I survived that cursed weekend, the terror of the Willamet still clings to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that in the heart of Oregon's wilds, the line between man and monster is terrifyingly thin. My name is Michael S. Thompson. I'm 40 years old. This happened during one of the loneliest weekends of my life, a desperate escape from memories that had haunted me for years. I had loaded my aging RV with the few belongings I could bear to take along and set my course for the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area, hoping that the vast shifting sands and howling winds might offer a measure of solace and a chance to confront the guilt that had clung to me ever since that terrible accident. I was an artist at heart, a quiet, introverted soul whose deepest wounds were hidden behind sketches and half-finished canvases. The accident had taken someone dear to me, and the self-blame had become an unyielding shadow. I craved redemption, or at the very least, a chance to understand the darkness that dwelled within me. The desolate beauty of the dunes, with their endless, ever-changing patterns, promised both isolation and reflection. The first stretch of the journey was uneventful. The roads led me along the rugged Oregon coast, where the sea crashed relentlessly against rocky outcroppings. I found a strange comfort in the wild, untamed landscape. Yet, as I pulled into a dusty, open area on the edge of the dunes, my RV, a relic that had served me faithfully for years, began to protest. Its engine coughed and spluttered, and after a short while, it sputtered to a halt. I stepped out into a world that felt both vast and oppressively intimate, the wind whispering secrets that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. My RV, battered by time, and the relentless assault of wind-blown sand was quickly proving to be as temperamental as my own mind. With a toolbox in hand and a heavy heart, I attempted makeshift repairs. The mechanical failures, however, were only the beginning of my troubles. As twilight bled into night, the dunes themselves seemed to come alive. I caught fleeting glimpses of a figure on the horizon, a spectral presence that vanished whenever I turned to get a better look. At first, I dismissed it as the trick of a tired mind, but the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at my already frayed nerves. The following day, I drove into a small coastal town that sat on the fringe of the dunes, in search of supplies and perhaps some human contact. In a dim, musty general store, I met Hank, a grizzled, weather-beaten local whose eyes had seen more than his share of despair. Over a cup of bitter coffee, Hank warned me in a low, gravelly tone. "These dunes are cursed, son. Folks get lost out there, and some say you can't trust the wind. It carries the sorrow of old tragedies and the restless cries of those who never left." His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with my own guilt and grief. I left the store with a mix of skepticism and unease. That night, as I returned to my RV, I discovered my vehicle vandalized, tires slashed and windows smashed. It wasn't hard to surmise that local drifters, or perhaps something even darker, had made their presence known. The assault on my RV was a harsh reminder that I was not alone out here. There were real people, desperate and dangerous, roaming the fringes of these wild lands. The next morning, I resolved to explore the dunes on foot, determined to find a vantage point where I could both assess my situation and perhaps lose myself in the relentless beauty of the landscape. The shifting sands underfoot were a constant reminder of life's impermanence, and with every step, memories of my past surfaced. Faces, voices, regrets. I kept thinking of Hank's warning and wondered if the strange happenings were mere coincidences or something more sinister. It wasn't long before I was ambushed. While navigating a narrow ridge, a ragtag group of desperate drifters sprang from behind dunes and rocky outcrops. Their eyes burned with suspicion and malice as they accused me of being a government spy or an opportunist. The confrontation quickly escalated into violence. I fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but their numbers overwhelmed me. A couple of blows sent me sprawling onto the hot, unyielding sand, and I felt the sting of betrayal, not just by strangers but by the very land that I had sought refuge in. Bruised and battered, I managed to break free, stumbling back toward my RV. The encounter left me shaken, my thoughts a tangle of fear and self-recrimination. As I huddled inside the RV for shelter, the wind picked up, carrying with it soft, mournful wails. In the shifting shadows cast by my flickering lantern, I saw her again, the Dune wraith. She appeared as a translucent figure draped in a tattered dress, her form melding with the sand and moonlight. At times, it seemed as though she was reaching out, her eyes full of sorrow and unspoken regret. It was as if she embodied the desolation and guilt that I had carried within me for so long. Over the next few days, the eerie presence of the wraith became impossible to ignore. I caught her reflection in the cracked mirrors of my RV, glimpsed her silhouette against the backdrop of swirling sandstorms, and even heard her whispered lamentations echoing in the gusts. The boundaries between my nightmares and reality began to blur. I questioned whether the spirit was a malevolent force intent on driving me to the edge, or perhaps a mirror of my own tortured soul. One particularly violent evening, a sandstorm descended upon the dunes with a fury that left me no choice but to seek refuge outside the confines of my failing RV. Cowering under the scant shelter of a collapsed structure, I was caught in the midst of a swirling maelstrom of grit and despair. The wind screamed around me, carrying voices that seemed to plead, curse, and mourn all at once. In the heart of the storm, amidst the chaos of whirling sand, I saw her clearly. A figure standing at the edge of my vision, illuminated by flashes of lightning. The Dune wraith, her eyes glistening with tears of sand and sorrow, approached me slowly. In that surreal moment, time seemed to slow, as her silent presence forced me to confront the true weight of my guilt. Her appearance was not one of terror but of tragic beauty, a spectral mirror reflecting the anguish I had long tried to bury. In the midst of that relentless storm, I felt a cathartic surge of emotion. The visions that had tormented me for years, the guilt, the self-recrimination, they all converged into a single, piercing moment of clarity. I realized that the sorrow embodied by the wraith was not separate from my own. It was as much a part of me as the blood that flowed in my veins. She was the personification of every regret, every misstep that had led me to this desolate place. As the storm abated, I found myself standing alone in a silence that was as heavy as the guilt I carried. The Dune wraith slowly receded into the shifting sands, leaving me with a sense of fragile release. The confrontation had not erased my pain, but it had forced me to acknowledge it, an essential step toward forgiveness and healing. In the aftermath, I faced a decision that would shape the rest of my life. My RV, though battered and broken in places, was gradually coming back to life after my desperate repairs. The dunes still whispered their ancient secrets, and the memories of the recent violence and supernatural encounters weighed on me. I could either choose to drive away, leaving behind the land that had both tormented and transformed me, or remain, accepting the harsh reality of my internal transformation and the possibility of forging a new beginning amid the shifting sands. In the quiet that followed the storm, I began a new journal entry, a candid reflection on the duality of human guilt and the promise of redemption. I wrote about the relentless winds, the brutal confrontations, and the spectral figure who had become an unexpected companion in my journey. The Dune wraith, with her silent, sorrowful gaze, had taught me that sometimes the most dangerous journeys are those that force us to confront the darkness within ourselves. I eventually decided to leave the dunes behind, driving my RV along the narrow, sunlit roads that snaked away from the desolate expanse. Yet, even as I moved toward a semblance of normalcy, I could never fully escape the memory of that haunting weekend. In the rearview mirror, on particularly quiet days, I would catch a glimpse of a figure, barely visible, a reminder that the past, with all its sorrow and regret, was never truly behind me. As I continue to drive forward, I am forever changed by what I experienced among those shifting sands. The dunes, with their eternal dance of creation and destruction, will always be a part of me, a testament to the night I faced my inner demons and the spectral sorrow of a lost soul. In that moment of confrontation and acceptance, I learned that redemption is not about erasing the past, but about finding the strength to live with it, and perhaps, in time, to forgive oneself. Now, every time I catch a glimpse of sand swirling in the wind or hear the mournful whisper of the ocean, I am reminded of the dune wraith and the fragile beauty of redemption. My journey through the dunes was not just a flight from my past, but a painful, transformative pilgrimage into the depths of my own heart. A pilgrimage that, despite its terror and isolation, may ultimately lead me toward healing. My name is Jessica Park. I'm 35 years old. This happened not long ago, when I decided to follow the last cryptic clues my father left behind before he vanished. He was a journalist, a man dedicated to uncovering the truth about environmental corruption. His disappearance had haunted me for years, and I couldn't let his work and his memory die without a fight. So I packed up my old RV, loaded it with nothing more than essential supplies and his scattered notes, and set out for Tillamuk State Forest in Oregon. I hoped that by retracing his footsteps, I could find answers, and maybe even expose the dark forces he had been investigating. Driving along the winding, forest-lined roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that the landscape itself was watching me. The towering pines and dense underbrush of Tillamuk had an eerie, almost conspiratorial quality. Every so often, as I passed by, I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of trees, twisted, cryptic markings that I had seen in my father's notes. There were also odd tire tracks off the main road, as if someone, or something, was deliberately trying to leave a sign. I kept my radio on, though mostly it filled the cabin with static and low, garbled voices that did nothing to comfort me. Late one afternoon, as the sky darkened unexpectedly, my RV started acting up. At first, it was a minor hiccup, a sputter of the engine, a flicker of the lights, but soon it became clear that my vehicle was struggling under the weight of its own age. I was forced to pull over in a desolate clearing deep in the forest. With no cell reception and only a limited supply of tools and spare parts, I knew that I'd be stranded for a while. Reluctantly, I set off on foot in search of help, leaving my RV behind as a temporary shelter. It wasn't long before I encountered a man walking along the side of the road. Dressed in worn jeans and a faded jacket, he had an easy smile and an air of familiarity that made my heart skip a beat with a mixture of hope and caution. "Need a ride?" he asked in a friendly tone. When I mentioned that I was stranded and on a mission to uncover the truth behind my father's disappearance, his eyes lit up with an uncanny intensity. He introduced himself as Eric and claimed he had known my father. He told me that he had even worked with him on some investigations, and that he could help me navigate the treacherous back roads and hidden trails of the forest. His local knowledge was invaluable, or so it seemed at first. Eric's story was persuasive, and after a short discussion I allowed him to join me. His presence made the oppressive isolation of the forest a little less daunting, and I found myself trusting him more than I perhaps should have. As we drove in my battered RV along the less traveled roads, Eric pointed out subtle signs that he said were evidence of illegal logging and corporate interference. His insights, however, were occasionally laced with inconsistencies. There were moments when his recollections didn't match up with what I had read in my father's notes, but I brushed these aside, attributing them to the stress of the situation. A few miles out from the clearing where my RV had broken down, we encountered our first real sign that something was deeply wrong. I noticed a black SUV parked discreetly at the side of the road, its windows tinted and its presence ominous. When I mentioned it to Eric, he just shrugged and said that sometimes folks in these parts tend to keep an eye on things. But the unease gnawed at me. Later that evening, while parked in a small, seemingly abandoned lot near a logging camp, I received a series of muffled phone calls. The voice on the other end was distorted, almost mechanical, repeating phrases like, "Don't trust him," and "Turn back now." I couldn't tell if it was a prank or a genuine warning, but the chill it sent through me was undeniable. Determined to press on despite the mounting signs of danger, I continued my investigation. I used Eric's guidance to navigate to a secluded area that he described as a safe house, where I could spend the night and regroup. The location was an old rundown cabin on the outskirts of the forest, a relic from an era when logging companies thrived in these parts. The atmosphere was heavy with neglect and decay. Inside, amidst the dust and cobwebs, I discovered a box of old newspapers and documents. My pulse quickened as I realized that one of the items was a battered, leather-bound notebook. I flipped it open and saw my father's handwriting scrawled across the pages. It contained detailed accounts of illegal logging operations, names of high-ranking officials, and even photographs that hinted at a disturbing alliance between corporate interests and local law enforcement. My discovery, however, was abruptly shattered when I noticed Eric acting strangely. Late at night, as I sat by a small fire outside the cabin, I caught him slipping away into the shadows. I followed him at a distance, my heart pounding with a mix of betrayal and dread. In the dim light, I watched as he approached a parked truck marked with the logo of a prominent logging corporation. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Eric was not the benevolent guide I thought he was. He was a mole, working for those who wanted to silence my father's investigation. Before I could confront him, he noticed my presence and bolted into the darkness, leaving behind a single object on the ground, a worn pocket watch engraved with my father's initials. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Fury and grief warred within me as I made my way back to the cabin. The weight of my father's legacy pressed down on me, and I knew that I was now alone in a fight against a powerful and dangerous enemy. The next morning, with the incriminating evidence clutched tightly in my hands, I set out on foot toward the remote logging camp that Eric had mentioned. The camp was hidden deep in the forest, a place where the illegal operations were said to be conducted under the cover of darkness. I moved cautiously, keeping to the less traveled paths, aware that corporate enforcers, shadowy figures in unmarked vehicles, might be tracking my every move. As I neared the logging camp, the atmosphere turned even more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on gravel and the distant hum of machinery. I found the camp by chance, a cluster of dilapidated sheds and makeshift offices, all camouflaged by overgrown vines and the encroaching wilderness. It was here, among the discarded documents and faded photographs, that I uncovered the final pieces of the puzzle, my father's journal, a series of photographs documenting illegal logging activities, and detailed records that implicated not only the logging corporation but also local officials. The evidence was damning. Before I could process my findings, the silence was shattered by the sudden roar of engines. A convoy of black SUVs emerged from the dense forest, their headlights cutting through the gloom like knives. I realized too late that I had been ambushed. Corporate enforcers, their faces cold and determined, descended upon me with the precision of a well-oiled machine. I barely had time to scramble for cover as they closed in, their shouts and orders echoing in the humid air. I darted between the sheds, heart pounding as I fought to keep the precious evidence safe. The enforcers were relentless, and it became clear that they were not merely hired thugs, they were deeply embedded in the local power structure. In the midst of the chaos, I heard the sound of a vehicle screeching to a halt. It was the local sheriff, a man I had hoped might be an ally, but whose dismissive attitude toward my concerns had always hinted at corruption. Now, as he stepped out of his car with a sneer, it was evident that he was in cahoots with the corporate enforcers. Desperation lent me strength. I grabbed a flare gun from a nearby crate, my only weapon, and fired it blindly into the dark. The flare exploded in a burst of light and noise, disorienting my pursuers for a brief moment. I used the confusion to dash deeper into the forest, adrenaline surging through me as I navigated the twisting trails. Every step was fraught with danger, and the dark, cold forest seemed determined to swallow me whole. I ran until my legs gave out, eventually collapsing in a small clearing hidden by thick foliage. My breath came in ragged gasps as I clutched the evidence to my chest, feeling the weight of the truth I now possessed. In that moment, I vowed that I would not let my father's disappearance be in vain. I had the proof, and I would expose the corruption that had cost him his life. But even as I resolved to fight back, I knew that the battle was far from over. The echoes of the enforcer's pursuit, the betrayal of Eric, and the cold complicity of the sheriff all left me with a chilling certainty. The forces aligned against me were vast, and they would stop at nothing to bury the truth. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I began the slow, arduous trek back to civilization. The journey was perilous, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder for signs of being followed. Every rustle in the underbrush, every distant engine hum sent a jolt of fear through my body. Yet, amidst the terror and isolation, I clung to the hope that I could make it out alive, and that the evidence in my possession would spark an investigation that would bring the powerful to justice. After what felt like an eternity of running and hiding, I finally reached a small town on the edge of the forest. There, I found refuge in a modest motel and managed to contact an investigative reporter who had once collaborated with my father. With trembling hands, I handed over the documents, photographs, and journal entries that exposed the nexus of corruption involving the logging corporation and local law enforcement. In that moment, I knew that I had ignited a firestorm that could not be easily extinguished. Even as I lay in that motel room, the events of the past few days replayed in my mind. The strange symbols on the trees, the unsettling phone calls, Eric's betrayal, and the harrowing ambush at the logging camp. I realized that the wilderness of Tillamuk State Forest was not merely a backdrop for environmental exploitation. It was a battleground where truth and treachery collided, and where even the smallest voice could challenge a mighty empire of corruption. I'm still haunted by the memories of that journey, the constant fear of being watched, the desperate chase through the darkened woods, and the sound of engines in the night. But I also carry with me a renewed sense of purpose. My father's legacy lives on in the evidence I uncovered, and in the determination to expose the injustice that lurks in the shadows of our natural world. Now, every time I pass through a forest or see a seemingly insignificant symbol carved into a tree, I am reminded of those long, perilous days. The memory of Eric's betrayal and the cold eyes of the enforcers serve as a stark reminder that the truth is a dangerous commodity, one that those in power will go to great lengths to silence. But I refuse to let that happen. The journey is far from over, and as I continue to pursue justice for my father, I know that I'm not only fighting for the environment, but for every lost soul who has been trampled under the weight of corporate greed and corruption. My story may have started with a desperate RV trip into the heart of Tillamuk State Forest, but it has become so much more: a fight for truth, a quest for justice, and a reminder that even in the darkest corners of our world, the light of integrity can still shine through. Oh, 3 Mini. My name is Michael Mike Donovan. I'm 34 years old. This happened one bitter October when my friends and I decided to escape our daily routines and head deep into Oregon's Siuslaw National Forest in an aging RV. We were chasing legends, rumors of a haunted cabin, and whispers of a creature known as the Wendigo. I thought we were in for a quirky adventure. I never imagined the terror that awaited us. I'd always been the practical one. As the designated leader, I prided myself on being resourceful and level-headed, even when our equipment was already showing signs of age. Our RV's navigation system flickered erratically, and the generator sputtered on more than one occasion, but we pressed on. Along with me were Laura Mitchell, whose compassion and intuition often kept us grounded; Jeremy J. Allen, whose reckless charm masked a darker side I didn't fully understand at the time; and Olivia Liv Thompson, quiet and observant, always the first to notice the smallest oddities. Our destination was a remote clearing near an old, dilapidated cabin, said to be a nexus of supernatural energy. The locals had warned us in hushed tones about the legends of the Wendigo, a gaunt, emaciated creature born from isolation and unquenchable hunger, but our excitement and youthful arrogance drowned out any caution. During the long drive, small tensions began to surface. Jay, ever the daredevil, laughed off every local warning, dismissing them as mere folklore. In contrast, Laura's steady insistence on respecting the forest's mysteries created a palpable unease between them. I tried to mediate, focusing on the practical issues like our failing equipment, but even I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that something was amiss. That first night at our campsite, the forest was unnervingly quiet. I remember stepping out of the RV to secure a faulty generator when I noticed peculiar claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. The marks were deep and deliberate, as if etched by a monstrous hand. Nearby, odd symbols were carved into the trunks, symbols that reeked of ancient, forbidden rites. An unnatural silence blanketed the woods, broken only by the occasional, blood-curdling howl that sent shivers down my spine. It was just before midnight when everything unraveled. We had gathered around a small fire, our nerves fraying as the wind howled through the pines. Suddenly, Liv, who had been quietly sketching the eerie surroundings, stood up, her eyes fixed on a distant glimmer. "Guys, I think I saw something," she whispered, voice trembling with a mix of wonder and fear. Before anyone could react, a soft, ethereal light beckoned her toward the dark edge of the woods. I called after her, but she was already moving, her figure swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Panic surged through me. "Liv!" I shouted, but the forest swallowed my words. Laura immediately sprang into action, her intuition screaming that something was terribly wrong. We fanned out, calling her name into the void. In our frantic search, we stumbled upon a grisly scene near the haunted cabin. The earth was disturbed, and scattered personal items lay strewn about as if discarded in haste. A set of crude, ritualistic implements, knives stained with dried blood, and ropes frayed by use, hinted at a violence we hadn't imagined. My heart pounded as I realized that Liv had been taken, and something far worse was unfolding. Before we could regroup, a sudden ambush shattered the night's tenuous calm. Figures cloaked in ragged animal skin garb emerged from the shadows. Their eyes were wild and unseeing, and in their midst I glimpsed symbols that matched those on the trees. These were no ordinary vandals. They were cultists, worshippers of the Wendigo, and they moved with a predatory purpose. I barely had time to react. In a flash, I was overpowered, a rough hand clamping over my mouth as I was dragged into the undergrowth. The world turned to darkness and pain. I woke hours later in a crude, makeshift cell beneath the dense canopy, the metallic tang of blood filling my nostrils. My body was aching from brutal blows, and every breath was a struggle. The cultists, gaunt, fanatic men and women, circled me, their murmurs in a language I didn't understand mixing with guttural howls that seemed to come from the very earth. They tortured me relentlessly, demanding to know where my friends were. Each question was accompanied by a fresh wave of pain, both physical and psychological, as they sought to break me. I refused to divulge anything, clinging to the hope that Laura and Jay would come for me, that they were still alive. Amid the torment, my mind reeled with betrayal. I remembered a furtive glance from Jay earlier that night, a glance that now seared my conscience. Somehow, in the midst of our collective fear, Jay had made a secret pact with these cultists, choosing self-preservation over loyalty. Time blurred in that subterranean prison of agony. Amid the haze of pain, I began to lose track of time. my thoughts oscillating between desperate memories of our laughter around the campfire and the now ghastly reality of my situation. I could hear distant sounds, the clash of branches, the relentless pounding of footsteps, and hope flickered that Laura had not abandoned us. Then came the moment of horrifying clarity. I overheard them mention a name, whispered with reverence and malice: the Wendigo. Its presence was not just a myth, it was as real as the cold, biting air of the forest. They spoke of it as both a deity and a curse, a force that demanded sacrifice in exchange for nature's wrath. The creature was said to roam the forest, its monstrous form a twisted amalgamation of human and beast, driven by insatiable hunger. In that moment I realized that my torment was only part of a larger, more terrifying plan. My friends, Laura, who had already organized a desperate search, and Liv, whose fate was now shrouded in darkness, were in imminent danger from not only the cultists but from the creature itself. When I finally managed to slip free from my bindings, a chance afforded by a moment of carelessness on the part of one of my captors, I crawled through the underbrush, each movement a symphony of agony and determination. I was disoriented, half mad from pain and fear, but the thought of Laura's fierce eyes and Liv's quiet smile pushed me onward. I vowed that I would survive, that I would fight my way back to them. Somehow, fate intervened. As I stumbled through the forest, a sudden violent crash shattered the silence. I heard shouts, Laura's voice, clear and commanding, rallying someone to her side. In a chaotic swirl of light and sound, I found myself in the midst of a brutal confrontation. Laura had gathered a small band of locals, and together they engaged the cultists in a desperate melee. The air was thick with the tang of blood and the clamor of violence. I mustered every ounce of strength to join the fray, driven by a blend of desperation and vengeance. The confrontation escalated quickly. In the chaos, I caught sight of Jay. His eyes were wild, his face marked with the desperation of a man who had chosen betrayal. With an unspoken signal to the cultists, he steered them away from his own survival, leaving me and Laura to fend for ourselves. The shock of his treachery stung as deeply as any physical blow. And then, the Wendigo. As if summoned by the carnage, a deep, bone-chilling howl echoed through the trees. Emerging from the darkness, the creature loomed larger than any nightmare I could have conjured. Its emaciated frame, elongated limbs, and eyes that burned with an otherworldly hunger sent terror coursing through every vein. The Wendigo's presence turned the battle into a maelstrom of surreal horror. The cultists, momentarily distracted by the abomination, faltered, and I seized the chance to pull myself up and fight back. Laura and I fought side by side, our movements fueled by raw adrenaline and the desperate need to survive. Each strike, each dodge, was a small act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The forest itself seemed to rebel against the Wendigo as if nature, too, resented the violation of its sacred boundaries. Branches whipped down like spectral hands, and the wind howled with a fury that shook the very ground beneath us. In the midst of the melee, I saw a flash of movement that made my heart lurch. A glimpse of Liv, standing at the edge of the clearing. For a brief, precious moment, hope surged within me. But then, as quickly as she appeared, she vanished into the murky depths of the forest. The realization hit me with crushing force. Liv had been taken by the cultists, and perhaps even marked by the Wendigo's malignant influence. Her disappearance was another cruel twist in a night of unspeakable horror. As the battle reached its fevered pitch, Laura's determined shouts guided our final push. We managed to rout the remaining cultists who scattered into the woods with howls of defeat and terror. The Wendigo, wounded but undeterred, retreated slowly into the shadows, leaving behind an air of malevolence that would haunt us forever. In the aftermath, amid the ruins of shattered trust and bloodied earth, I was left grappling with the bitter taste of betrayal. Jay's treachery, his cowardice in the face of monstrous evil, was a wound that might never heal. Now, as I sit in the quiet aftermath, the forest seems to murmur with memories of that terrible night. My body bears the scars of torture and battle, and my soul is marred by the loss of Liv and the betrayal of a friend. Laura, with her steadfast resolve, continues to search for any sign of Liv, determined to rescue her, or at least learn her fate. The knowledge that the Wendigo still roams these woods, and that cultists lurk in the dark corners of human depravity, leaves me with a constant gnawing dread. I know that nothing will ever be the same. That fateful trip, meant to be an escape, transformed into a crucible of isolation, betrayal, and unimaginable horror. In the dead of night, when the wind howls and the trees seem to whisper secrets of ancient evil, I am reminded of the price we paid for our curiosity. Survival, I've learned, is not just a matter of physical strength, but also the will to face the darkness within ourselves. And so, with every trembling step I take on this scarred path, I carry the memory of that night, of Liv's vanishing, of my own torment, and of the monstrous form of the Wendigo stalking the fringes of sanity. My journey through the Siuslaw National Forest remains a testament to the fragile boundary between man and myth, a boundary that, once crossed, leaves only echoes of betrayal and the chilling whisper of a hunger that can never be sated. My name is Clara Matthews. I'm 29. This happened one bleak November, when I decided to leave behind a heart full of grief and an unbearable past to seek solace in the raw wilderness of the Rogue River region in Oregon. I loaded up my old RV, a clunky, temperamental vehicle that had seen better days, and hit the long, winding road, determined to find some semblance of healing. I was also planning to document my journey on my personal blog, a small effort to turn my pain into something meaningful. Almost from the start, my RV began to show signs of its age. The radio, once a reliable companion during lonely nights on the road, now filled with static and inexplicable bursts of eerie voices. The generator faltered repeatedly, plunging me into sudden darkness that left me shivering under blankets in the cold. But I pressed on, my heart set on escaping the suffocating memories of loss that haunted me. One overcast afternoon, as I drove along a narrow, rugged back road, I noticed a barely visible sign pointing toward an area known for its abandoned structures. Intrigued and desperate for distraction, I followed the winding path until I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among towering pines. The cabin, worn by time and neglect, exuded an aura of sorrow and mystery. Its broken windows and sagging porch spoke of decades of abandonment, yet something about it called to me, a whisper of a story left untold. I parked the RV a safe distance away and ventured toward the cabin on foot. Inside, the musty air was thick with dust and forgotten memories. In one corner of a crumbling room, I found an old diary bound in faded leather. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with hurried, desperate script. It told the tragic tale of a local woman whose life had ended in mystery. Her final entries described nights of terror and whispered mentions of a curse that left her with an overwhelming sense of doom. The diary hinted that she had encountered something otherworldly, something that drove her to disappear without a trace. I couldn't help but feel a chill as I read her desperate words, the ink seeming to bleed with sorrow and fear. That night, back in my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I set up my temporary camp and tried to rest, but the malfunctioning radio filled the silence with cryptic static, and every creak of the RV felt like a secret being whispered in the dark. Then, around midnight, I caught a glimpse of something. A pale, almost translucent figure standing near the edge of the clearing. The figure was that of a woman, her eyes sad and distant, as if trapped in an endless morning. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or a ghost summoned by the diary's sorrowful tale, but I knew I wasn't alone. The following morning, as I tried to repair the generator with a mix of hope and resignation, a man appeared at my side. He introduced himself as Ben, a rugged local with a weather-beaten face and eyes that seemed too intense for casual conversation. He offered to help fix my generator, his tone friendly, yet laced with an intensity that unsettled me. Over the next few days, Ben stayed around, sharing local lore about the region and the tragic history of the abandoned cabin. He told me stories of the woman from the diary, hinting that her ghost still wandered these woods, seeking justice or perhaps release from her eternal torment. At first, his presence was a welcome relief in my isolated journey. However, as he lingered longer than expected, I began to notice his unsettling interest in the diary. He would ask invasive questions about the details of her disappearance and fixate on the diary's darker passages, his gaze lingering on words that described rituals and curses. Despite his help with the generator, a growing sense of dread gnawed at me, an intuition that Ben's intentions were not as pure as they seemed. One evening, as twilight draped the forest in deep shadows and the temperature plummeted, the RV's light flickered ominously. I stepped outside to check on the generator, only to find Ben waiting in the dark, his expression unreadable. Before I could speak, he moved swiftly, his hand clamping over my mouth. I was caught off guard. A sharp, stinging sensation surged as he injected me with a sedative. My world blurred, and darkness claimed me. When I came to, I found myself confined in a cramped, dingy room in a remote cabin that I had never seen before. The air was heavy with damp and decay. I struggled against the bindings that held me, realizing with dawning horror that I had been kidnapped. Ben's voice, low and disturbingly calm, drifted in from the next room. He began a slow, deliberate monologue about the tragic legacy of the woman in the diary, about how her spirit was meant to live on as a warning against the exploitation of grief and vulnerability. Over the next agonizing hours, Ben subjected me to psychological torment. By dim candlelight, he played recordings of the radio static from my RV and recited passages from the diary, twisting them into a perverse ritual that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. His obsession was palpable. He seemed determined to make me understand, to force me to confront the spectral legacy that haunted this place. Every question I asked was met with silence or a cryptic smile, as if he delighted in my confusion and fear. During my confinement, I began to notice small, unsettling occurrences. At times, I would hear soft footsteps in the corridor or catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure, a woman much like the one I had seen near my RV, watching from the shadows. These silent apparitions seemed to be both a warning and a reminder of the tragic past encapsulated in the diary. Their presence, though intangible, filled me with a resolve to fight back. I realized that I needed to harness my own inner strength to outwit Ben and escape the nightmare. One cold, moonless night, while Ben was momentarily distracted by his own ritualistic recitations, I managed to loosen the ropes binding my wrists. My heart pounded in my ears as I crept through the darkness, every creak of the wooden floor a potential harbinger of discovery. I edged toward a half-open door that led into a narrow corridor lined with peeling wallpaper and rusted pipes. As I moved, I could hear Ben's soft murmurings echoing from behind, mingling with the quiet, sorrowful whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin. I finally reached a back door and slipped out into the cold night air. The forest loomed ahead, a labyrinth of gnarled trees and twisting shadows. Adrenaline and fear fueled my escape as I sprinted into the darkness, not daring to look back until I was well away from the cabin. Behind me, I heard shouts. Ben's enraged, desperate cries that pierced the night as he realized I was fleeing. Running through the tangled underbrush, I followed a narrow, barely discernible trail that I hoped would lead me back to civilization. The forest seemed alive, its rustling leaves and snapping twigs echoing like the footsteps of unseen pursuers. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pressed on, driven by the fierce need to reclaim my freedom. Hours later, I stumbled upon a narrow dirt road illuminated by the weak glow of a distant vehicle. With trembling hands, I flagged it down. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and a heavy accent, took one look at my disheveled state and offered to drive me to the nearest town. As I sat in the warm, reassuring glow of his truck, I recounted the events of the last few hours, my voice trembling with a mix of terror and relief. Later, safely in a small motel room on the outskirts of a town, I tried to piece together the fragments of that surreal night. Ben's betrayal cut deeply. His charismatic facade had concealed a dangerous obsessive streak that exploited my vulnerability. I spent sleepless nights rereading the diary and pondering the ghostly apparitions I had witnessed. Were they real, or manifestations of my own fractured mind? The memory of the spectral woman, with her sorrowful eyes and silent, accusatory presence, haunted me relentlessly. Over time, the physical scars began to fade, but the emotional and psychological wounds remained raw. I continued to document my experience on my blog, detailing every unsettling moment in the hope that sharing my story might bring some clarity, and perhaps help someone else who might be grappling with similar demons. I also reached out to local authorities and mental health professionals, determined to understand whether the events I experienced were the work of a disturbed human being or something far more inexplicable. In the months that followed, I learned that the abandoned cabin and the diary were part of a long-forgotten chapter in the local history. The woman in the diary had been a victim of a scandal, her life ruined by a man much like Ben, whose obsession and cruelty had eventually led her to vanish without a trace. Her spirit, it seemed, was forever bound to the place where she had suffered, a spectral echo of sorrow and vengeance. While I never saw her ghost again, I sometimes sensed her presence on quiet, solitary nights, a reminder that some wounds never truly heal. The ordeal left me forever changed. I emerged from that nightmare with a newfound strength and a deep understanding of the fine line between reality and the supernatural. I had faced a darkness that was both human and inexplicable, and in doing so I discovered that the true terror often lies not in the ghosts of the past, but in the betrayal and cruelty that can reside within a single human heart. Even now, as I write these words, I feel a chill every time the wind howls outside my window. The memories of that fateful night, the malfunctioning RV, the eerie static on the radio, the abandoned cabin, and Ben's twisted betrayal, remain etched in my mind. I carry them with me as scars, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the strength it takes to reclaim one's life after being plunged into darkness. I still travel occasionally, though I now choose paths away from haunted cabins and malevolent strangers. I've learned that healing is a slow, painstaking journey, a process of confronting one's inner demons and finding light amid the darkness. My story, filled with both supernatural dread and raw human cruelty, has become a part of who I am. And while the ghost of the past may occasionally whisper in the silence of the night, I have found a way to listen, and ultimately to move forward.